In the darkness of a Baghdad museum storage room, thousands of clay tablets rest in numbered boxes, cuneiform wedges pressed into wet clay 5,000 years ago, the oldest written stories humanity possesses, and among them texts that describe cosmic warfare, divine beings descending from the heavens, and catastrophes that shattered the ancient world. These are the Sumerian tablets, and what they contain has ignited one of the most passionate debates in ancient history. Welcome. It's good you're here, however late the hour might be where you are. Thank you for choosing to spend this time exploring one of archaeology's most contested mysteries. The texts are undeniable. Clay fragments recovered from the ruins of Nippur, and Nineveh, painstakingly translated by Assyriologists over the past century and a half. They speak of beings called the Anunnaki, gods who came to Earth in the distant past, who created humanity for labor, who fought wars using weapons of devastating power. Mainstream scholarship interprets these as mythological narratives, symbolic stories that ancient Mesopotamians created to explain their world, their origins, their relationship to the divine, rich theology expressed through vivid metaphor. But alternative researchers, beginning prominently with Zecharia Sitchin in 1976, propose something else entirely. They suggest these texts preserve literal history, memories of extraterrestrial visitors who genetically engineered humanity, who mined Earth's resources, whose conflicts left scars on the planet's surface. Ancient astronaut theory reframes every god as an advanced being, every divine weapon as forgotten technology, every creation myth as scientific procedure described in pre-scientific language. Both interpretations deserve exploration. Both have passionate advocates. Our purpose tonight isn't to settle this debate. Scholars with decades of linguistic training disagree. Archaeological evidence supports multiple readings. What we're here to do is walk through the actual texts, examine what they say, explore how different frameworks interpret identical words carved into clay. The wonder lies not in choosing certainty, but in witnessing how humanity's oldest writings continue to generate profound questions about who we are and where we came from. Take a breath. Where are you right now? Perhaps in bed, lights dimmed, ready for sleep. Maybe in a chair, headphones on, the world outside your window dark and quiet. Wherever you are, let yourself settle. There's nowhere else you need to be, nothing that requires your attention, except these ancient voices speaking across millennia. If you're finding value in this exploration, a like or subscription helps others discover these journeys through deep time. Your support keeps this work possible, and I'm grateful for it. Now then, picture the Mesopotamian plain at dusk. Around 2500 BCE, the Euphrates flows wide and brown between banks lined with date palms. Ziggurat terraces rise against the fading light, mud brick pyramids climbing towards stars just beginning to emerge. In temple courtyards, oil lamps flicker to life. Scribes finish their day's work, accounting tablets drying in rows, inventories of barley and wool and silver. But on some tablets, different content, stories, cosmologies, lists of kings who ruled before the Great Flood, whose reigns stretched for impossible thousands of years. The scribes didn't question these numbers, they copied them faithfully from older tablets, which had been copied from tablets older still, reaching back through generations to sources now lost. They preserved what their ancestors knew, or believed, or remembered, and what they preserved speaks of a time when gods walked the earth, when heaven and earth were not yet separated, when the Anunnaki descended, and everything changed. We begin where all written history begins, in the cities of Sumer, in the wedge-shaped marks pressed into clay by hands that turned to dust 5,000 years ago, in texts that have survived empire after empire, waiting in darkness to tell us what they know. The tablets are speaking. Let us listen. The Tigris and Euphrates begin their journey in the highlands of what is now eastern Turkey, fed by snowmelt from mountains that still hold winter into April. Gravity pulls the water south across 1,000 kilometers, through landscapes that shift from stone to soil, from elevation to plain. By the time these rivers reach southern Mesopotamia, they've slowed. They meander. They deposit silt in layers that build, year after year, creating land from what was once shallow sea. 10,000 years ago, the world was emerging from ice. Glaciers that had covered much of the northern hemisphere for 70,000 years were retreating. Sea levels rose as frozen water returned to liquid. Coastlines redrew themselves. The Persian Gulf extended much farther north than it does today, reaching inland to where cities would eventually stand. The climate warmed, rainfall patterns shifted, and in this transition between ages, something became possible that hadn't been before. Settlement, agriculture, the gathering of humans in numbers large enough to require organization. The land itself was young in human terms. Alluvial plain, geologists call it, soil carried from distant mountains, deposited by water over millennia, building elevation grain by grain. When the floods came each spring, predictable as the seasons, they brought not just destruction but renewal, fresh earth, nutrients that would feed crops. The rivers gave and took in cycles the people would learn to read, to anticipate, to build their lives around. Before the first cities, before the first temples, there was this flat earth extending to horizons unmarked by human construction. Reed marshes, where the rivers lost themselves in channels and backwaters, date palms growing wild along the banks, birds in numbers that darkened the sky during migration. The land was fertile, dangerously so. Anything planted grew with vigor that suggested divine favor, or at least divine indifference to human struggle. The sky at night revealed something modern city dwellers can barely imagine. Darkness so complete that the Milky Way cast shadows, stars so numerous they formed not scattered points, but rivers of light arcing overhead. The moon, waxing and waning, provided the first reliable measure of time beyond the day. 30 days, roughly, from new moon to new moon, 12 lunar months making a year, though the numbers never quite aligned perfectly with the solar year, requiring adjustments the scribes would eventually master. Temperature extremes defined the experience of living there. Summer heat that reached 50 degrees Celsius in the shade, though shade was scarce, winter nights dropping to near freezing, the cold amplified by wind that had nothing to slow it across the open plain. The people who would eventually inhabit this land didn't choose it for comfort. They chose it, or it chose them, because the soil was rich, and the water, though temperamental, was present. Long before the first cuneiform tablet was pressed, before the first king ruled, this landscape was shaping what would become possible. The rivers flooded unpredictably, unlike the Nile with its reliable annual schedule. This unpredictability required cooperation on a scale that individual families couldn't manage. Dikes, channels, irrigation systems that needed maintenance, labor, coordination. Perhaps this is where hierarchy began, not from conquest but from necessity. Someone had to organize the work. Someone had to decide how resources would be distributed when harvests failed or floods destroyed what had been built. Archaeological surveys reveal scattered settlements dating back to 6000 BCE, small villages where people cultivated barley and wheat, kept sheep and goats, made pottery that shows regional styles developing, different communities creating distinct aesthetic traditions. The Ubaid culture, archaeologists call it, named after the site where their distinctive pottery was first identified. These weren't Sumerians yet. Possibly they weren't even Sumerian-speaking. The linguistic landscape of ancient Mesopotamia remains partially mysterious. Layers of languages overlapping, influencing each other, some disappearing entirely. Evidence suggests these early inhabitants built temples, not the massive ziggurats that would come later, but structures clearly dedicated to purposes beyond the domestic, raised platforms, rooms with altars, offerings left in specific patterns. Whatever they believed about the divine, it required physical expression, places set apart from ordinary life. The practice of temple building in Mesopotamia reaches back so far that its origins blur into the undocumented past. The Ubaid period produced strange artifacts, figurines with elongated heads, reptilian faces, large eyes that seem almost alien when viewed through modern sensibilities. Were these representations of gods, priests in ceremonial masks, shamans in trance states? We don't know. The people who made them left no written explanation. Some researchers see in these figures evidence of something otherworldly, beings different from ordinary humans. Mainstream archaeology interprets them as stylized human forms or mythological creatures, products of religious imagination. The clay offers no definitive answer. Climate studies reveal that around 4000 BCE, conditions in Mesopotamia became particularly favorable. The Holocene climatic optimum, a warm, wet period that made agriculture more productive, populations more stable. Food surplus allowed specialization. Not everyone needed to farm. Some could become craftspeople, traders, priests, administrators. Complexity accumulated, and with complexity came the need for record-keeping that would eventually birth writing itself. The stage was set, though no one living then could have known what was coming. The land lay ready, the waters flowed, the stars turned overhead in patterns that would be observed, recorded, woven into mythologies that tried to explain why things were as they were, and into this landscape. Across centuries we can trace only through archaeological layers and radiocarbon dates, came the people who would call themselves the black-headed ones, who would build the first true cities, who would create writing, and whose texts would speak of gods called the Anunnaki. Uruk, around 4000 BCE, was becoming something unprecedented, a settlement growing beyond village scale, population concentrated in numbers that that required new forms of organization. Estimates suggest 10,000 people, perhaps more, living within sight of each other, the largest human gathering yet achieved. And with this density came problems that small communities had never faced. How do you feed 10,000 people? The answer required planning beyond any individual's capacity to hold in memory. Fields needed to be assigned, labor organized, harvests collected and distributed. Someone had to track who worked, how many days, who received how many rations of barley, who paid what to the temple in offerings or taxes. Memory alone couldn't manage this complexity. Something else was needed. The first marks in clay were not literature. They were accounting. Small tokens in various shapes representing different goods. A cone for a measure of grain, a sphere for a unit of animal fat. These tokens were placed inside clay envelopes for transport, for record keeping. But the envelopes were opaque. You couldn't see inside without breaking them. So some anonymous innovator around 3400 BCE, began pressing the tokens into the envelope's wet surface before sealing them, creating an external record of the internal contents. From this practical problem, writing emerged. The impressed marks became sufficient on their own. The tokens themselves became unnecessary. Scribes began pressing shaped styluses into clay tablets, creating wedge-shaped marks, cuneiform, literally wedge-shaped in Latin. The earliest tablets are dense with these marks, neat rows of impressed symbols representing quantities of goods, barley, sheep, textiles, silver, the mundane necessities of temple and palace economies, preserved because clay, once dried or baked, becomes nearly indestructible. Thousands of these early tablets survive. They've been excavated from sites across southern Mesopotamia, each one a window into economic transactions 4,000 years removed from us, a receipt for 30 sheep delivered to the temple, an account of barley distributed to workers, records of copper ingots received from distant trade, the bureaucracy of civilization, captured in marks that would outlast bronze, outlast marble, outlast every organic material humans would use to record their thoughts. But accounting marks, however sophisticated, couldn't express everything humans needed to say. Over centuries, the system expanded. Symbols that had represented objects began to represent sounds. Phonetic writing emerged, allowing scribes to capture not just what was traded, but what was thought, what was believed, what stories explained the world. By 2600 BCE, the system could record anything the human voice could speak: poetry, laws, letters, and myths. The earliest literary texts we possess come from this period. Administrative archives that include among the barley receipts and sheep counts, tablets containing hymns to gods, prayers for protection, fragments of stories. These weren't yet the great epics. Those would come later, but they show that writing, invented for commerce, had become a tool for something else entirely: the preservation of collective memory, the transmission of knowledge across generations, the attempt to answer questions that accounting could never address. What existed before the world? Where did humans come from? Why do we die? The Sumerians developed answers, encoded them in cuneiform, copied them, distributed them across their civilization. Temple libraries accumulated tablets the way later cultures would accumulate scrolls and codices. When one tablet wore out from handling or broke, scribes copied its contents onto new clay. Some texts were copied so many times across so many centuries that we have versions from different cities, different time periods, allowing scholars to trace how stories evolved, how details shifted while core narratives remained stable. Among these early texts appear the names of gods who would dominate Mesopotamian religion for 3,000 years. An, the sky god; Enlil, lord of the air and storms; Enki, god of wisdom and fresh water; Inanna, goddess of love and war; and the Anunnaki, a collective term for gods of earth and the underworld, beings who in some texts number 7, in others 50, in still others 300. The exact count varied, but their importance remained constant. These were the gods who made decisions affecting humanity, who gathered in assembly, who determined fates. The Ubaid culture that preceded literate Sumer left temples but no texts. We can see what they built, but can only guess at what they believed. The Sumerians gave us something different, not just structures but explanations, not just offerings but the reasons for offerings. Their texts reveal a worldview where divine and human realms intersected constantly, where gods had needs and desires not unlike humans, where the cosmic order required maintenance through ritual and sacrifice. One text from this early period, the Eridu Genesis, describes creation emerging from primordial waters. The gods create humans to maintain the irrigation canals, to till the fields, to provide food for the divine households. Humanity's purpose, in this telling, was service, labor. The word used for humans in some texts translates roughly as workers, or bearers of the burden. Whether this reflects actual social conditions or theological metaphor, scholars debate, perhaps both. The metaphor may have resonated because it reflected lived experience in a civilization where most people labored in fields or workshops, where hierarchy was visible and pervasive. Other texts from this period mention floods, a great deluge that destroyed the cities, killed most of humanity, reset civilization to its beginning. Multiple Sumerian tablets reference this event, though details vary. The flood as divine punishment, the flood as natural catastrophe. One righteous man warned, building a boat, saving animals and his family. The parallels to later biblical narratives are unmistakable, because the biblical writers knew these Mesopotamian stories, borrowed from them, adapted them to monotheistic framework. When 19th century archaeologists first translated these texts and recognized the flood narrative, it sent shockwaves through scholarship. The Bible wasn't unique. Its stories had antecedents, sources, origins in cultures that preceded Israel by millennia. This realization reshaped understanding of how religious traditions develop, how stories migrate across cultures, how what seems divinely revealed may have more complex human origins. The tablets keep speaking still, as new translations refine understanding and previously unread fragments are deciphered. They speak of a world before ours, not in the temporal sense but in the conceptual sense, a world where gods were real presences, where cosmic forces had personalities and preferences, where the line between natural and supernatural didn't exist because everything was, in some sense, alive and purposeful. And they speak of the Anunnaki, though in these earliest texts their role remains somewhat ambiguous. Gods of judgment, gods of the earth, divine beings whose will shaped human destiny. Later texts would expand on who they were, what they wanted, what they did. The foundation was being laid in clay tablets pressed in cities whose ruins now lie beneath Iraqi sand, waiting for archaeologists with permits and funding to continue the work of bringing ancient voices back into the light. Writing changes everything, though those who invented it probably didn't realize the magnitude of what they'd created. The first scribes saw themselves as servants of the temple economy, tracking goods, managing resources. They couldn't have imagined that their pressed marks in clay would preserve not just commercial transactions, but an entire civilization's inner life, its fears and hopes and explanations for existence itself. The scribal schools, ejibas, trained boys in the complex art of cuneiform. It took years. The system involved hundreds of signs, each capable of multiple meanings depending on context. A single wedge pattern might represent a concrete object, an abstract concept, or a phonetic sound. Reading required not just memorizing signs, but understanding grammatical structure, recognizing context, sometimes guessing when texts were damaged or ambiguous. The scribes formed a specialized class, valued for their rare skill, employed by temples and palaces throughout Mesopotamia. Their training tablets survive, practice pieces where student scribes copied lexical lists, multiplication tables, model contracts. Mistakes are visible, corrections made by teachers, the eternal struggle of learning apparent across 4,000 years. Some tablets preserve proverbs and sayings that were used as writing exercises. The scribal art is the father of masters. Wealth is far away, poverty is close at hand. Glimpses of daily wisdom, ordinary concerns, rendered permanent by accident of preservation. But alongside these mundane tablets, something else emerges in the archaeological record around 2100 BCE. Literary compositions of conscious artistry, not just functional writing but aesthetic writing, crafted for effect, designed to move the listener or reader. The Sumerian language by this period was becoming a classical language, still used for religious and literary purposes, even as Akkadian, a Semitic language, became the spoken vernacular. This diglossia, two languages occupying different social registers, meant that Sumerian literary texts were being composed in a language already archaic, lending them additional authority and sacred weight. The hymns to temples are particularly revealing. Each major city had its patron deity, its central temple, and scribes composed elaborate praises describing the temple's construction, its beauty, the divine presence dwelling within. These hymns use repetition and parallel structure to hypnotic effect. House of great splendor, house of holy rituals, house that determines fates. The accumulation of epithets creates a sense of overwhelming numinous power. Modern readers might find them repetitive. Ancient listeners would have found them appropriate to their subject, the repetition itself a form of devotion. The myths begin to appear in more complete form. The story of Enki and Ninhursag, where the god creates 8 plants in a garden, eats them despite warnings, falls ill and must be healed. Echoes of Eden, scholars note, though the Sumerian version is older and more complex. the tale of Inanna's descent to the underworld, where the goddess of heaven voluntarily enters the realm of death, strips herself of power at 7 gates, dies, and is resurrected. Themes of death and rebirth that would recur across cultures, across millennia, and texts that mention the Anunnaki more explicitly. The Anunnaki as judges of the dead in the underworld. The Anunnaki as assembly of gods who make cosmic decisions. In the myth of Inanna's descent, they are the 7 judges who turn their eyes of death upon the goddess, who speak words of condemnation that kill her. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, they are present at the Great Flood, weeping at the destruction they've helped unleash. They are, in these texts, powerful but not omnipotent, bound by cosmic laws they didn't create, subject to hierarchies within the divine realm. The Sumerian king list deserves particular attention. This text, preserved in multiple copies from different periods, claims to record every ruler of Sumer from the time when kingship descended from heaven until the present. But the early kings ruled for impossible durations. Alulim, the first king of Eridu, ruled for 28,800 years. Alaljar ruled for 36,000 years. 8 kings total before the flood, their combined reigns totaling 241,200 years. After the flood, the reign lengths decrease but remain superhuman. Gradually, across generations, they approach realistic human lifespans. By the time we reach kings for whom we have independent archaeological confirmation, the reign lengths match what historical records from neighbouring civilizations suggest. This progression from mythological time to historical time happens on the page, visible in the structure of the text itself. Mainstream scholarship interprets these enormous numbers as mythological, symbolic of the great antiquity the Sumerians attributed to their civilization. Alternative researchers ask different questions. What if these numbers preserve actual records, perhaps measured differently than we measure time? What if the years weren't solar years but lunar months, or some other unit? Mathematical attempts to convert the figures have yielded inconsistent results. The mystery remains unresolved. The flood narrative appears across multiple Sumerian and later Akkadian texts with variations. In the Sumerian Eridu Genesis, the god Enki warns Ziusudra to build a boat before the coming deluge. In the Akkadian Atrahasis epic, the same basic story is told with different emphasis. The flood as divine response to human overpopulation, noise disturbing the god's rest, the decision to destroy humanity. One god's descent, his secret warning to one righteous man, the survival of that man and his family, the preservation of animals, the eventual reconciliation between gods and humans. Geological and archaeological evidence confirms major flooding events in Mesopotamian history. The Tigris and Euphrates, unpredictable in their overflow, periodically inundated cities, destroyed settlements, killed populations. Whether one particular flood entered cultural memory as the flood, or whether multiple catastrophes merged in collective remembering into a single archetypal event, remains debated. Memory and myth intertwine in ways that resist easy separation. What's undeniable is that something happened. Some experience of catastrophic scale imprinted itself on Mesopotamian civilization deeply enough that texts written across 1500 years all reference it, all use it as a temporal marker dividing before from after. The flood became the boundary between mythological and historical time, between the age when gods walked openly among humans and the age we still inhabit, where divine presence is less direct, more mediated. The tablets spread across the ancient Near East. Sumerian cuneiform was adapted to write Akkadian, Hittite, Elamite, other languages. The stories travelled with the script. Libraries accumulated in cities from Ebla to Ugarit to Hattusa. When archaeologists excavated the library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh in the 19th century, they found thousands of tablets collected by an Assyrian king who lived in the 7th century BCE, but who treasured copies of texts already 1500 years old in his time. Among them, the Epic of Gilgamesh, in its most complete form, the Enuma Elish creation epic, the Atrahasis flood narrative, and countless other works. Clay survives what bronze and stone do not. It survives fire, surviving better for it since fire bakes the tablets hard. When armies sacked cities and burned palaces, they inadvertently preserved the libraries. The tablets that might have crumbled with time were instead fired into permanent hardness, waiting in ash and rubble for modern excavators to recover them, brush them clean, read once again the words pressed into soft clay by scribes whose names we mostly don't know, whose faces we'll never see, whose voices speak to us still across an enormous gulf of time. The ruins had been visible for centuries, massive mounds rising from the Iraqi desert, tells built from the accumulated debris of civilizations layered one atop another. Local inhabitants knew them as ancient places, sometimes quarried them for brick, occasionally found curious objects while digging, but their true nature remained hidden until European powers developed interest in the ancient Near East during the 19th century. French and British archaeologists arrived in Ottoman Mesopotamia with diplomatic backing, generous funding, and romantic notions about recovering biblical lands. Paul-Émile Botta began excavating at Khorsabad in 1843, uncovering the palace of the Assyrian king Sargon II. Austin Henry Layard followed at Nimrud and Nineveh, shipping enormous winged bulls and carved reliefs back to European museums, where crowds gathered to witness the ancient world materialized before them. But the tablets puzzled everyone initially. Thousands of clay fragments inscribed with wedge-shaped marks, discovered in palace archives and temple libraries, they clearly conveyed information, showed systematic organization, had the appearance of writing, yet no European scholar could read them. The script was entirely unknown. Multiple languages appeared to use the same basic signs, complicating efforts at decipherment, and without a bilingual text, without some kind of Rosetta Stone providing parallel translations, cracking the code seemed nearly impossible. The breakthrough came from an unexpected direction. Scholars working on Old Persian inscriptions from Achaemenid Iran noticed that some royal monuments included 3 versions of the same text, inscribed in 3 different scripts. One was Old Persian, which could be partially understood, another was Elamite. The third was the mysterious wedge-shaped writing from Mesopotamia. Henry Rawlinson, a British officer stationed in Persia, spent years copying the massive inscription carved into a cliff face at Behistun, risking his life on scaffolding hundreds of feet above the ground to record every sign. By comparing the 3 scripts, assuming they said identical things, scholars began assigning phonetic values to the wedge marks. Progress was slow, tentative, filled with false starts, but gradually the system yielded. The language revealed itself as Akkadian, a Semitic language related to Hebrew and Arabic. By the 1850s, several scholars working independently could read Akkadian cuneiform with reasonable accuracy. Then came a greater surprise. Many tablets from the earliest archaeological layers weren't in Akkadian at all, but in an older language that used the same script. This language, eventually called Sumerian, wasn't Semitic, it wasn't Indo-European, it appeared unrelated to any known language family, an isolate preserved only in cuneiform texts. Deciphering it required using Akkadian translations as intermediaries, since later Mesopotamian scribes had created lexical lists translating Sumerian terms into Akkadian for their own training purposes. George Smith, a self-taught scholar working at the British Museum, was cataloguing tablets from Nineveh when he recognized something extraordinary. Among the fragments was a text describing a great flood, a boat built to survive it, birds sent out to test for dry land. The parallels to Genesis were unmistakable. In 1872, Smith announced his discovery to the Society of Biblical Archaeology. The presentation caused a sensation. Here was proof that the biblical flood narrative had ancient Near Eastern antecedents, that Jewish scribes had been working within a broader Mesopotamian literary tradition. Funding immediately materialized for Smith to return to Nineveh and search for missing portions of the text. Remarkably, he found additional fragments during his expedition, though he died of dysentery in Syria on his way home in 1876, only 36 years old. His work continued through others. The text he'd begun recovering is now known as Tablet 11 of the Epic of Gilgamesh, the flood story as told to Gilgamesh by Utnapishtim, the man who survived. As more tablets were translated, the scope of Sumerian literature became apparent. Not just flood narratives, but creation myths, hymns to gods, prayers for protection, wisdom literature, royal inscriptions, law codes, letters, commercial contracts. The earliest literature in human history, predating Homer by more than a millennium, predating the biblical texts in their current form by centuries, and woven through these texts repeated appearances of divine beings called the Anunnaki. The term itself proved difficult to translate precisely. Anu relates to An, the sky god. Ki relates to earth. The suffix suggests a group or collective, those of heaven and earth perhaps, or those descended from An. Different texts use the term in different ways, sometimes referring to specific groups of 7 judges, sometimes to larger assemblies of 50 or more gods. The inconsistency suggests the term had different meanings in different periods or different cities. In the Descent of Inanna, the Anunnaki are judges who condemn the goddess to death in the underworld. In creation texts like Enuma Elish, they appear as younger gods who support Marduk's rise to supremacy. In flood narratives, they participate in the decision to destroy humanity, though not unanimously. Some texts describe them as gods who remained on earth, while other gods dwelt in heaven. Others describe them as specifically underworld deities. The picture is complex, layered, resistant to simple categorization. Academic conferences in the late 19th and early 20th centuries saw intense debates about how to interpret this material. Were these myths revealing about Sumerian society, their values and fears? Were they purely religious texts, meant for ritual contexts? Could they contain historical kernels, actual events transformed through retelling into mythological form? The questions mirrored debates about Greek mythology, biblical narratives, folklore worldwide. Samuel Noah Kramer, who spent decades in the 20th century translating Sumerian texts, titled his popular book History Begins at Sumer, arguing that the civilization had invented or pioneered numerous aspects of human culture, writing, certainly, but also the first schools, first legal codes, first pharmacopoeia, first agricultural almanac, first literary debates, first love song. Whether all these firsts stand up to scrutiny remains debated, but his point was clear. Sumer represented a foundational moment in human cultural development. The texts themselves, beyond their content, raised questions about transmission and preservation. Why did Assyrian kings in the 1st millennium BCE treasure copies of Sumerian texts from the 3rd millennium BCE? What impulse drives civilizations to preserve their past even when that past is barely comprehensible? Modern parallels exist. We preserve medieval manuscripts, study dead languages, maintain archives of texts most people will never read. The impulse seems fundamental to human nature, this desire to remember what came before, yet vast amounts have been lost. Most Sumerian literature survives only in fragments. Complete tablets are rare, often we have only portions of texts, broken off mid-sentence, missing their beginnings or endings. Scholars piece together narratives from multiple incomplete sources, acknowledging uncertainty about what originally stood in the gaps. It's like reconstructing a novel from random pages found in different locations, knowing entire chapters are simply gone. New tablets continue to surface. The Iraq Museum holds tens of thousands of cuneiform texts not yet fully published or translated. Private collections worldwide contain pieces acquired through legal and illegal markets. Universities and museums maintain collections that require specialists decades to process completely. Each new text has potential to clarify obscure references, provide missing context, or occasionally completely reshape understanding of some aspect of Mesopotamian culture. The Anunnaki appear frequently enough across diverse texts that they clearly held important positions in Sumerian theology, but their exact nature, their relationship to other gods, their role in cosmic order, all this remains partially obscure. The texts assume knowledge they don't explain, reference stories they don't fully tell, use terminology whose meanings may have been obvious to ancient readers, but require scholarly reconstruction now. And so the tablets speak, but not always clearly. They preserve voices from humanity's first civilization, but those voices speak languages we've had to relearn, express concepts that don't always map neatly onto modern categories. The wonder is that they speak at all, that clay pressed 5,000 years ago still yields meaning to patient scholars willing to spend careers learning dead languages and deciphering fragmentary texts. Among the thousands of clay tablets recovered from Mesopotamian sites, one text has generated particular fascination and controversy. Multiple copies exist, found at different locations, dating from different periods. The earliest versions come from the early 2nd millennium BCE. Later copies were made as late as the Seleucid period, after Alexander the Great's conquest. Despite variations in detail, all versions share the same basic structure, a list of kings who ruled Sumerian cities, organized chronologically, recording the length of each reign. The text begins with a phrase that has echoed through scholarly discussions for a century. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. Eridu, archaeological evidence confirms, was among the earliest Sumerian settlements, its temple foundations dating back to the Ubaid period around 5000 BCE. The city held special significance in Mesopotamian memory as humanity's first city, the place where civilization began, and according to the king list, its first ruler was Alulim, who reigned for 28,800 years. The numbers are extraordinary. 8 kings ruled before the flood, their combined reigns totaling 241,200 years, or in some versions 456,000 years, depending on how certain figures are read. Alaljar of Eridu ruled 36,000 years. Enmenluana of Bad Tibira ruled 43,200 years. The text presents these figures matter-of-factly, with the same formulaic structure used for later historical kings, whose reign lengths are verifiable. Then comes the flood. The flood swept over. After this break, kingship descends from heaven again, this time to Kish. The post-flood kings rule for still superhuman but decreasing periods. Gower of Kish ruled 1,200 years. Gradually, across generations, the reign lengths approach human scales. By the time the list reaches kings from the mid-3rd millennium BCE, figures for whom we have contemporary inscriptions and archaeological evidence, the numbers align with reality. Gilgamesh of Uruk, the legendary hero of the epic, appears in the list as a historical king who ruled 126 years, still longer than human lifespan, but far shorter than the antediluvian rulers. Scholars have proposed numerous explanations for these figures. One theory suggests the numbers are purely symbolic, representing the vast antiquity Sumerians attributed to their civilization. Another proposes they're based on different measurement systems, perhaps lunar months rather than solar years, though converting them mathematically doesn't produce consistent results. Some suggest the numbers accumulated through errors in transmission, scribes miscopying figures or misunderstanding archaic number systems. A few researchers have speculated about different human lifespans in the distant past, though this lacks biological support. The Assyriologist Thorkild Jacobson examined the king list extensively in the mid-20th century. His analysis revealed that the text was compiled around 2100 BCE during the 3rd dynasty of Ur and served political purposes. By claiming unbroken succession of kingship from Eridu forward, by showing how different cities took turns holding supreme authority, the list legitimized Ur's current dominance as the latest city to which kingship had been transferred. The antediluvian rulers added antiquity and divine sanction. The flood provided a dramatic break, allowing new beginnings. Yet the care with which later scribes copied this text suggests they took it seriously. It wasn't just propaganda. Multiple scholarly commentaries exist from later periods, attempting to reconcile discrepancies between different versions, debating which reading was more authentic. The text functioned as historical reference, cited in other documents, used to establish chronological context. Whatever modern scholars make of the impossible reign lengths, ancient Mesopotamians treated the king list as containing genuine information about their past. Hermann Hilprecht, excavating at Nippur between 1889 and 1900, worked in conditions that would appall modern archaeologists. His team lived in mud brick structures on site, endured extreme heat, dealt with occasional threats from local tribes, unhappy with foreign excavators. The work was grueling, the techniques crude by current standards, but Hilprecht was driven by conviction that the mounds concealed treasures of immeasurable historical value. In the temple district, his team uncovered a building filled with tablets, not palace archives documenting administration, but a scribal school, an aduba, where young men had learnt cuneiform centuries before. Practice tablets littered the rooms, mathematical exercises, lexical lists, model contracts, and among them, literary texts being copied as part of the curriculum. One room in particular yielded tablets that, when pieced together, provided previously unknown portions of Sumerian myths. Hilprecht described the moment of realization, brushing dirt from a tablet and recognizing familiar divine names, understanding that he held stories humanity hadn't read in 2,000 years. The recovery of these texts took months of careful cleaning, cataloguing, and preliminary translation. The finds were shipped to the University of Pennsylvania, where they remain in the collection today, still being studied, still yielding insights as new scholars bring fresh perspectives to their interpretation. The king list includes a curious detail that mainstream scholarship largely dismisses, but alternative researchers emphasize. Several of the antediluvian kings are described with the Sumerian term Eri, which some translate as descended from heaven or of heavenly origin. This same term appears in other contexts referring to gods. Does it simply mean these kings claimed divine ancestry, a common ancient practice, or does it preserve memory of something else? Beings who came from elsewhere, whose origins were literally celestial. Academic consensus favors the first interpretation. Kings throughout ancient Mesopotamia claimed divine parentage or divine selection. It legitimized their rule, placed them above ordinary humanity. The term Eri fits comfortably within this interpretive framework, but the alternative reading asks why this particular terminology was used, why the emphasis on heavenly origin for these specific rulers predating the flood. The flood itself presents archaeological puzzles. Excavations at multiple Sumerian sites have revealed layers of water-deposited sediment separating occupation levels. At Ur, Leonard Woolley found an 8-foot layer of clean clay with no artifacts, lying between older and newer settlement remains. He initially believed he'd found evidence of the biblical flood. Later analysis suggested it represented a significant but localized flooding event, serious enough to disrupt habitation, but not covering the entire region simultaneously. Other sites show similar flood deposits at different chronological levels, indicating multiple major flooding events across centuries. The Tigris and Euphrates flooded catastrophically many times in Mesopotamian history. Perhaps one particularly devastating flood entered cultural memory so deeply that that all subsequent floods were understood in its context. Perhaps multiple floods merged in collective remembering, or perhaps the flood in the text is entirely mythological, a narrative device explaining why the world needed recreation, why humanity required a fresh start. The king list doesn't resolve these questions. It simply records what Sumerian tradition claimed happened, a flood that swept over the land, ending one era of kingship and beginning another. Whether this reflects historical event, multiple events compressed into one, or pure mythology remains contested. The text itself maintains its enigmatic quality, presenting impossible numbers alongside verifiable facts, blending history and myth in ways that resist clean separation. Modern dating methods, radiocarbon analysis, stratigraphic excavation, ceramic typology, all these help establish when cities were founded, when temples were built, when writing emerged. The archaeological timeline for Sumer is well established in broad strokes, but the king list operates in different temporal registers. It measures time not just by solar years but by cycles of cosmic significance, by the duration of divine-human contact, by the span between creation and flood and recreation. Perhaps the ancients understood something we've forgotten, that time is not uniform, that different kinds of time exist simultaneously, historical time measured in human generations, mythological time stretching into impossible antiquity, cosmic time against which human lifespans barely register. The king list may be attempting to map all three simultaneously, using numbers we interpret literally, but which were meant to convey different meanings about the depth and weight of the past. The name appears first in texts from the mid-3rd millennium BCE, though the concepts behind it likely stretch back further. Anunnaki. The syllables carry weight in Sumerian theology, denoting gods of particular importance, though their exact function shifts depending on context, location, and period. In the city of Eridu, where Sumerian civilization claimed its origins, the Anunnaki were associated with Enki, god of wisdom and fresh water. Enki's temple, the Iabzu, house of the cosmic waters, stood at what was believed to be the source of all fresh water, the underground ocean, from which springs and rivers emerged. The Anunnaki in Eridu's traditions were Enki's followers, gods who assisted in maintaining cosmic order, who helped in the creation of humanity, who taught crafts and knowledge to the early people. 50 kilometers north, in Nippur, the Anunnaki took on different associations. Nippur was Enlil's city, and Enlil was storm and wind, authority and justice. In Nippur's theology, the Anunnaki formed a divine assembly, gathering to make decisions about the fate of cities and nations. They weren't simply servants of Enlil, but members of a cosmic council with their own agency and voices. Texts describe them debating, disagreeing, voting on matters of divine policy. The word itself has been analysed extensively by linguists. Anu clearly references An, the sky god, chief of the pantheon in early Sumerian theology. Ki means earth. The element Na functions as a genitive or possessive marker. The suffix Kei marks plural. So approximately, those of An and Ki, or sky-earth beings, or perhaps princely offspring of the union between heaven and earth. The ambiguity in translation reflects genuine complexity in the Sumerian, which used terms with multiple valences depending on grammatical context. In the Descent of Inanna, dated to around 2000 BCE in its currently preserved form but likely older in oral tradition, the Anunnaki appear as judges of the underworld. Inanna, goddess of heaven, descends to visit her sister Ereshkigal, queen of the dead. At each of 7 gates, Inanna must remove one item of her divine power: crown, lapis lazuli beads, breastplate, golden ring, measuring rod and line. When she arrives naked and bowed low before Ereshkigal, the 7 Anunnaki judges are present. They fix their eyes of death upon her. They speak the word of guilt. Inanna dies and her corpse is hung on a hook. This is metaphor, certainly, expressing something about the necessity of death, the stripping away of power, the journey every being must make into darkness. But the Anunnaki's role as judges, as those who determine worthiness, who pronounce sentence, appears consistently across multiple texts. They occupy positions of cosmic authority, implementing divine law. The Atrahasis epic, preserved in Old Babylonian versions from around 1700 BCE, but drawing on earlier Sumerian sources, presents a different view of the Anunnaki. In this text, they are worker gods, assigned by the senior deities to dig irrigation canals, maintain river courses, perform the hard labour necessary to make the earth habitable. For 40 years, the text says, they work without rest. Then they rebel. They burn their tools, surround Enlil's temple, demand relief from their intolerable burdens. The senior gods debate what to do. They cannot simply destroy the Anunnaki, who are divine and cannot die. Enki proposes a solution: create a new species to bear the labor instead, humanity. The text describes humanity's creation in detail. Enki and the mother goddess Nintu mix clay with the blood of a slain god, creating a being that is part earth, part divine. This being can think, speak, worship, and most importantly, can work. The Anunnaki are released from their labor. Humanity takes their place. This narrative has sparked enormous debate. Some scholars see it as theological justification for the rigid class hierarchies of Mesopotamian society, where most people labored in fields and workshops for the benefit of elites. Others interpret it as expressing genuine anxiety about labor and its meanings, questioning why existence requires such struggle. Alternative researchers read it differently, as literal history describing genetic engineering, the creation of a worker species by beings who needed laborers for their projects on Earth. The text itself makes clear that humanity's purpose was service. The word used for humans in some contexts translates roughly as awilu, which can mean both human and worker. The connection between identity and function was fundamental. You were what you did. Humanity existed to serve the gods through labor, through sacrifice, through maintaining temples and providing offerings. Yet the relationship wasn't purely exploitative in the text's framework. The gods needed humanity, depended on human activity to sustain cosmic order. Without humans to maintain irrigation, crops wouldn't grow. Without offerings, the gods would go hungry. The interdependence was real within the mythological system. Humanity served the gods, but the gods required that service, creating a mutual obligation that ran both directions. In the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic composed around 1100 BCE, but synthesizing much older traditions, the Anunnaki appear as supporters of Marduk, the young god who defeats Tiamat, the primordial chaos goddess. After Marduk's victory, the Anunnaki help construct the cosmos from Tiamat's corpse. They build the heavens, set the stars in place, create the calendar. 50 Anunnaki are mentioned specifically as those who establish cosmic order under Marduk's direction. This version presents the Anunnaki as builders, architects of the universe, working under divine direction to implement the plan that will allow life to flourish. It's a role quite different from judges of the dead or rebellious workers. The flexibility of the term, its ability to denote different divine groups in different contexts, suggests that Anunnaki function somewhat like angels would in later traditions, a broad category that could be specified further when needed, but that generally indicated divine beings of high rank serving specific functions. Physical descriptions of the Anunnaki in texts are rare and usually vague. They're called great gods and powerful gods. They're described as shining, radiant, terrifying in their glory. These are conventional epithets used for many deities. A few texts mention them wearing horned crowns, a standard symbol of divinity in Mesopotamian iconography. Some describe them as bearded, though this too was standard for depicting gods and kings in art. No text explicitly describes them as physically different from humans in ways that would suggest non-human origin. They're larger in status, but not obviously different in form. This absence of detailed physical description is notable when comparing with later traditions that developed more elaborate angelology. The Mesopotamians seemed more concerned with what gods did, what powers they wielded, what their relationships with each other were, than with cataloguing their physical appearance. What is clear from the texts is that the Anunnaki held authority. They made decisions affecting humanity. They implemented divine will. They judged, decreed, created, destroyed, and humanity, in the theological framework the texts express, existed at their sufferance, created for purpose, maintained for service. Whether these texts preserve literal history or express theological truths through narrative, whether they describe actual beings or metaphorically represent natural forces and social structures, has been debated since their decipherment. The texts themselves don't resolve the question. They simply state what they state, that the Anunnaki existed, that they acted in certain ways, that their actions shaped human destiny, and in the layers beneath Mesopotamian tells, more tablets wait. In museum storage rooms, unexamined boxes hold fragments that might clarify, might complicate, might completely reshape current understanding. The Anunnaki remain partially mysterious, not because the texts are entirely unclear, but because they assumed knowledge they didn't fully explain, referenced stories they didn't completely tell. The clay still speaks, but it speaks in a language we've had to reconstruct, expressing concepts that don't always map onto modern categories, preserving memories that might be history, might be theology, might be something between the two that we lack words to properly name. The Babylonians inherited Sumerian traditions and transformed them. By 1200 BCE, when the Enuma Elish reached its final form, Babylon had become the dominant power in Mesopotamia. The city's patron god, Marduk, needed elevation to match Babylon's political supremacy. The creation epic accomplished this by placing Marduk at the center of cosmic origins, making him the hero who brought order from chaos. The text begins with primordial conditions. When on high the heaven had not been named, firm ground below had not been called by name. Before anything existed, there were only two beings, Apsu, the fresh water, and Tiamat, the salt water. These weren't abstract forces but conscious entities, personified deities. They mingled their waters together, and from this union, the first gods emerged. The younger gods were noisy. They disturbed Apsu's rest with their activity, their constant movement and speech. Apsu grew resentful, complained to Tiamat that he couldn't sleep, proposed destroying their offspring to restore quiet. Tiamat initially objected. These were their children, but Apsu was determined. He plotted their annihilation. Enki, wisest of the young gods, discovered the plot. He acted quickly, using magic to put Apsu into deep sleep, then slaying him. From Apsu's body, Enki created his dwelling place, establishing his temple above the slain freshwater god. Here Enki and his consort Damkina conceived a son, Marduk, born with supernatural attributes, perfect in every way, endowed with 4 eyes and 4 ears to perceive everything, with flames shooting from his mouth when he spoke. Tiamat, enraged by her consort's death, prepared for war. She created an army of monsters, serpents, dragons, storm demons, the scorpion man, fishmen, and 11 others of similar horrifying aspect. She elevated Kingu, one of the gods, to leadership, gave him the tablets of destiny that controlled fate itself. This wasn't mere revenge but existential threat. If Tiamat won, the cosmos would return to undifferentiated chaos. The young gods panicked. None could stand against Tiamat and her monstrous army. They turned to Marduk, who agreed to fight on one condition. If he defeated Tiamat, they must acknowledge him as supreme king of the gods, granting him authority to decree fates, making his word unchangeable. The gods agreed. They held an assembly, tested Marduk's power by having him destroy and recreate a constellation through speech alone. When he succeeded, they armed him and sent him forth. The battle between Marduk and Tiamat forms the epic's dramatic core. Marduk approached with bow, net, mace, and the 4 winds as allies. Tiamat opened her mouth to swallow him. Marduk sent a wind into her jaws, inflating her body until she couldn't close her mouth. Then he shot an arrow through her open mouth, through her insides, piercing her heart. Tiamat died. Her army scattered in terror. Marduk stood over Tiamat's corpse and considered what to do with it. He split her body like a shellfish, the text says, creating from one half the dome of heaven, from the other half the foundation of earth. From her eyes he made the Tigris and Euphrates flow. From her ribs he constructed the mountains. Her tail became the Milky Way. Every part of her body became some feature of the ordered cosmos. This is creation through violence, order emerging from the defeat of chaos. The pattern appears across multiple ancient mythologies. Greek titans defeated by Olympians, Norse giants fought by Acer, Egyptian Set battling Horus. Something in human experience resonates with this narrative structure, perhaps reflecting how civilizations must impose order on wilderness, how consciousness emerges from and struggles against unconscious forces. After creating the physical world, Marduk addressed the problem of divine labor. The gods still needed servants to maintain the cosmos, to provide food through agriculture and offerings. Marduk proposed creating humanity. He asked which god had incited Tiamat's rebellion. Kingu was identified. Kingu was executed, and from his blood mixed with clay, humanity was fashioned. The text specifies that humans were created to bear the burden of the gods, to perform the labor that would free the divine beings for higher purposes. The Anunnaki appear in this context as witnesses and beneficiaries. After humanity's creation, the Anunnaki gather to celebrate, to construct Babylon as Marduk's earthly dwelling, to establish the rituals that would govern the relationship between divine and human realms. 50 Anunnaki are named specifically as those who helped build the cosmos under Marduk's direction, who set the stars in their courses, who established the calendar that would regulate agricultural and religious cycles. The text emphasizes astronomical order. Marduk creates the 300 stars of heaven, assigns them to watch over the year. He establishes the positions of planets, determines the moon's phases, instructs the sun in its daily course. The cosmos becomes predictable, knowable, subject to pattern and law. This wasn't just theological claim, but reflected genuine Babylonian astronomical achievement. By the time this text was composed, Mesopotamian scholars had developed sophisticated mathematical models for predicting planetary positions, eclipse cycles, seasonal changes. The Enuma Elish served ritual function. It was recited annually during the Akitu festival, Babylon's New Year celebration held at the spring equinox. The recitation wasn't entertainment, but necessary ritual action, a reenactment of creation that symbolically renewed the cosmos for another year. King and people participated in processions, ceremonies, sacrifices that marked the transition between old year and new, between chaos and renewed order. Reading the text now, in translation, we encounter it as literature. Ancient Babylonians encountered it as something else, enacted truth, words carrying power, recitation that accomplished something beyond mere storytelling. The boundary between myth and reality wasn't fixed the way modern categories assume. The story was true in a way that didn't require empirical verification, true because it expressed fundamental patterns, true because it guided how life should be lived. Alternative interpretations ask whether the text preserves memories of actual events. Could Tiamat represent a planetary body that once existed in the solar system, destroyed in some cosmic catastrophe? Could the battle describe astronomical events witnessed and remembered? Mainstream scholarship sees these as forcing modern scientific frameworks onto ancient theological texts, reading literalism where metaphor was intended. The debate continues, each side convinced of its framework's validity. What remains undisputed is the text's influence. It shaped Mesopotamian thought for more than 1,000 years. Elements of it appear in biblical creation narratives, though transformed through monotheistic framework. The pattern of order emerging from chaos, of younger gods defeating elder powers, of humanity created for divine service. All these motifs echo through subsequent religious traditions. The Enuma Elish stands at the beginning of a long conversation about origins, purposes, cosmic meaning that continues still. Around 1700 BCE, during Babylon's Old Babylonian period, a scribe named Kuiah copied out a text on 3 tablets. His name appears in the colophon, the signature line that ancient scribes used to mark their work. The text he copied was already old, drawn from Sumerian sources centuries earlier. We call it the Atrahasis epic, named for its protagonist, the exceedingly wise one. The epic begins not with humanity, but with the gods' own labour problem. When the earth was young, when cities had not yet been built, the senior gods divided the cosmos among themselves. Anu took the heavens, Enlil took the earth and air, Enki took the waters beneath the earth. But the actual work of shaping the earth, digging irrigation channels, dredging rivers, building canal systems, this work fell to the Anunnaki. The text is specific about the burden. For 40 years, the Anunnaki laboured. They excavated the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, defined their courses, dug canals connecting them. The work was backbreaking, endless, without rest or relief. They carried loads of earth in baskets, dug through mud and clay, cleared channels that collapsed and had to be redug. The text uses language that describes actual construction work, terms that Mesopotamian labourers would have recognised from their own experience. Then the Anunnaki could bear no more. They burned their tools in fire. They assembled at night and surrounded Enlil's temple, demanding audience. When Enlil emerged, the Anunnaki presented their grievance. The work was too hard, the burden too heavy, their suffering too great. They declared they would work no longer. Enlil was furious at what he saw as rebellion. He called an assembly of the senior gods. Anu and Enki joined the debate. What should be done with the Anunnaki, who refused their assigned labour? The gods couldn't simply destroy them. They were divine, immortal, but cosmic order required that the work continue. Without maintenance, the irrigation systems would fail. The earth would return to swamp and desert. The project of civilization would collapse. Enki proposed the solution that would define humanity's role in the cosmic order. Create a new being. Fashion a creature from clay, as the gods themselves had been formed from primordial elements, but make this being mortal, limited, specifically designed for labour. The mother goddess Ninchu would shape the body. Enki would provide the divine element by mixing the clay with blood from a slain god, ensuring the new creature could think and speak, but would remain firmly beneath divine status. The text describes the creation process with terminology that some researchers interpret as metaphorical, others as potentially literal. 7 male and 7 female humans were created initially. They were called Lulu, literally mixed being or hybrid. The divine blood gave them consciousness, intelligence, the capacity to understand instructions. The clay gave them mortality, limitation, the need to eat and reproduce and eventually die. The Anunnaki were released from their labour. Humanity took their place in the fields, in the construction projects, in the endless maintenance that civilization requires. The text presents this as relief for divine beings, but it also establishes humanity's fundamental purpose. We exist to work, to serve, to bear burdens that would otherwise fall on higher beings. Centuries pass in the narrative. Humanity multiplies. The earth fills with people. Cities spread across the land. Population grows exponentially. And with this growth comes noise. Humanity's collective activity, their speech, their daily lives, create a disturbance. Enlil, who values order and quiet, finds he cannot sleep. The noise of humanity irritates him constantly. Enlil decides to reduce the population. First he sends plague. Many die, but the survivors reproduce, and within decades the population recovers. Then he sends drought. Crops fail. Famine spreads. But Enki secretly helps humanity by sending fish from the rivers, ensuring enough survive to rebuild. Enlil tries again with famine so severe that people turn to cannibalism. Society nearly collapses, yet still they persist. Finally, Enlil determines on total solution. A flood that will wipe the earth clean, destroying all humanity, returning the world to its pristine quiet. He makes the other gods swear to keep the plan secret. Humanity must not be warned. The destruction must be complete. But Enki, who helped create humanity, who taught them agriculture and arts, cannot bring himself to allow total annihilation. He's bound by oath not to tell humans directly. So he speaks to the wall of a reed hut where Atrahasis sleeps. He addresses the wall, not the man, technically keeping his oath while ensuring Atrahasis hears every word. Atrahasis woke in darkness, his name suggesting the wisdom that would allow him to understand what he'd heard. The god Enki had spoken to the reed wall of his dwelling, and the words carried warning of catastrophe beyond anything humans had experienced. Flood was coming, waters that would cover the earth, drowning all life. Enki's instructions were specific. Atrahasis must build a boat, a structure large enough to house his family, representatives of all animals, seed for crops, tools for rebuilding. The dimensions were given precisely. The boat must be covered, sealed with bitumen inside and out to make it waterproof. Atrahasis must work quickly, tell his neighbors he's leaving to avoid Enlil's anger, imply he's moving to live under Enki's protection in the waters below. The deception would prevent panic and interference. Atrahasis built through 7 days and nights. He gathered materials, shaped timber, constructed the vessel according to divine specifications. On the 7th day he loaded the boat with his family, animals and provisions. Then he sealed the door from inside and waited. The flood came with violence that terrified even the gods. Rain fell in torrents, underground waters burst upward, rivers overflowed their banks and merged into a single devastating inundation. The text describes the gods fleeing before the deluge they'd unleashed, climbing to the highest heavens, cowering like dogs. Even Enlil, who commanded the flood, was frightened by its magnitude. For 7 days and 7 nights, the waters raged. Then gradually they subsided. The boat came to rest on a mountain. Atrahasis opened a window and looked out on silence. The earth was empty of human life except for those inside the boat. The cities were gone, dissolved back into mud. The fields were buried under silt. Everything humanity had built across centuries had been erased. Atrahasis sent out birds to test for dry land. A dove returned, finding nowhere to perch. A swallow returned similarly. Finally a raven flew out and didn't return, indicating land had emerged enough for scavengers to find food. Atrahasis opened the boat and made an offering to the gods. The smell of roasting meat rose to the heavens. The gods who had gone without offerings during the flood crowded around like flies, desperately hungry. When Enlil arrived and saw survivors, his anger erupted again. Someone had violated the oath, warned humanity, allowed the plan to fail. But the other gods turned on Enlil. They hadn't known the flood would be so terrible. They regretted their agreement. The destruction had been too complete, too horrifying. Humanity shouldn't be entirely eliminated. Some balance must be found. A compromise emerged. Humanity would be allowed to continue but with limitations. Human lifespans would be reduced, making each generation shorter. Certain women would be made infertile, reducing birth rates. Natural predators and diseases would be introduced, keeping population in check without requiring another total destruction. And humanity would continue its role as workers, providing for the gods, maintaining order, bearing the burden that the Anunnaki had rejected. The text ends with these new conditions in place, the cosmic order restored but modified, the relationship between divine and human realms redefined by the catastrophe and its aftermath. The Sumerian pantheon contained numerous deities, but 2 figures stand out for their influence over human affairs and their contrasting approaches to humanity's existence. Enki and Enlil, brothers in some versions, rivals in others, together shaped Mesopotamian understanding of divine will and cosmic order. Enlil's domain was wind and storm, breath and authority. His name translates roughly as Lord Wind, or Lord of the Air. He dwelt in Nippur, the religious center of Sumer, the city that held no permanent political supremacy, but maintained spiritual importance across all periods. His temple, the Ekur, mountain house, was considered the axis connecting heaven and earth. When gods assembled to make cosmic decisions, they gathered at Enlil's house in Nippur. The texts portray Enlil as stern administrator. He established laws, decreed fates, demanded proper order. He wasn't cruel, but neither was he particularly merciful. Justice mattered more than compassion. When humanity transgressed, when cosmic order was disturbed, Enlil's response was swift and often devastating. The flood that nearly destroyed humanity came at his command. Various plagues and famines sent to punish or control human populations originated with Enlil's decrees. Enki occupied a different role entirely. His name means Lord Earth, or Lord of the Foundation. Though his specific domain was fresh water, the Abzu, the underground ocean from which springs and rivers emerged, his city was Eridu, southernmost of the Sumerian settlements, possibly the oldest. His temple stood at what was believed to be the source of all fresh water, the point where the cosmic waters broke through to the surface world. Enki was called the Wise One, the clever god, master of magic and crafts. Multiple texts describe him as humanity's benefactor and protector. When the gods decided to create humans, Enki supervised the process, contributed his knowledge to the design. When humanity needed instruction in agriculture, metallurgy, writing and other civilized arts, Enki provided teaching. When Enlil sought to destroy humanity through flood, Enki found a way to warn Atrahasis, despite being bound by oath to silence. The contrast between these two deities reflects a tension fundamental to Mesopotamian thought: order versus wisdom, law versus craft, harsh justice versus compassionate intervention. Neither was purely good or evil in the texts. Both served necessary functions. Enlil's order made civilization possible. His laws prevented chaos. Enki's wisdom made life bearable. His knowledge gave humanity tools to survive. One myth describes their conflict directly. Enlil decided to test Enki by sending various problems to the earth that Enki was supposed to solve. Drought threatened the crops. Enki brought rain. Disease struck the livestock. Enki revealed medicinal plants. Invasions threatened the cities. Enki taught defensive strategies. Each challenge Enlil presented, Enki countered with some innovation or intervention. The contest ended without clear victory, establishing that both order and wisdom were necessary. Neither could operate effectively without the other's balance. Another text describes how Enki organized the world after creation, assigning deities to oversee specific functions. He appointed gods to manage irrigation, to supervise farming, to maintain the boundaries between territories. This wasn't Enlil's strict hierarchy, but Enki's pragmatic organization, ensuring everything had its place and purpose. The text reveals Enki traveling across the earth, visiting each region, establishing its particular character and resources. The sexual dimensions of both gods appear frequently in myths. Enlil's relationship with the goddess Ninlil began with what the text describes as rape, for which Enlil was initially banished from Nippur, though he was eventually restored after Ninlil bore his children. The story troubled ancient commentators as much as it troubles modern readers. Some versions present it as seduction rather than force. Others acknowledge its problematic nature, but use it to explain why Enlil had to descend temporarily to the underworld, establishing precedent for later myths of divine descent. Enki's sexuality appears as creative rather than violent. Multiple texts describe him impregnating various goddesses, creating new deities who serve specific cosmic functions. One myth has him eating plants in a garden, getting sick, and requiring healing. Another describes him organizing the world's resources while drunk, making decisions he later regrets. These stories present Enki as fallible, his wisdom limited by appetites and mistakes, more human-like in his imperfections. The Anunnakian texts featuring Enki and Enlil usually align with one or the other depending on the specific narrative. In the Atrahasis epic, the Anunnaki are the workers who rebel, forcing the creation of humanity. They serve Enlil's command but grow weary of his demands. Enki treats them more gently, recognizes their legitimate grievances, solves the problem through innovation rather than punishment. This pattern repeats. Enlil demands, Enki provides alternatives. The Anunnaki benefit from Enki's interventions while remaining ultimately subject to Enlil's authority. Archaeological evidence reveals how these theological conflicts manifested in actual religious practice. Nippur's temples received offerings from all Sumerian cities, maintaining its position as neutral religious ground where different city-states could gather despite political rivalries. Eridu's temples show evidence of continuous habitation from the earliest periods through the fall of Sumer, suggesting deep-rooted traditions that predated later political centralization. Imagine yourself as a priest in Nippur, around 2400 BCE. You serve in Enlil's temple, responsible for daily offerings and maintaining ritual purity. The temple's wealth is evident everywhere. Silver and gold inlaid in the doorways, precious stones decorating the cult statue, fine textiles hanging in the sanctuary. The economy of the entire city revolves around temple activities. Farmers bring their tithes, craftspeople provide specialized goods, scribes maintain records of everything entering and leaving the temple stores. Your day begins before dawn with purification rituals, washing in the sacred pool, changing into clean linen garments, preparing yourself to approach the divine presence. Other priests are performing similar preparations. The morning offering must be ready exactly at sunrise, the timing calculated by astronomical observers who track the stars and planets with mathematical precision. The Atrahasis epic suggests certain interpretations that mainstream scholarship and alternative research handle differently. Academic consensus reads these as mythological expressions of social structures, theological attempts to explain hierarchy, labor, and the human condition. The gods represent natural forces personified. Floods are meteorological events given narrative meaning. Humanity's creation from divine blood and clay expresses the dual nature of human existence, mortal bodies animated by consciousness that allows abstract thought and moral choice. Alternative researchers see potential literal history. Could the Anunnaki have been actual beings? Could their labor rebellion describe conflicts among extraterrestrial visitors? Could humanity's genetic engineering be described in pre-scientific language as mixing clay and blood? The enormous reign lengths in the king list, the sophisticated astronomical knowledge, the detailed descriptions of divine powers, all these feed speculation that something more than mythology is being preserved. Both interpretations struggle with the same evidence, reaching different conclusions based on different assumptions about what's possible, what ancient peoples could have known, what forms of communication might exist between radically different contexts. The texts themselves don't resolve the debate. They simply preserve what Mesopotamian scribes believed worth recording, worth copying, worth transmitting across generations until clay tablets would be buried in ruins, waiting for modern excavators to rediscover them and restart conversations that had fallen silent for millennia. Are at its height, around 2100 BCE, housed perhaps 65,000 people within its walls and surrounding agricultural zone. The city spread across 60 hectares, dense with structures built from mud brick, organized into neighborhoods that grew organically over centuries. Walking through Ur streets, you'd encounter the smell of beer brewing, bread baking, livestock penned in courtyards, human waste in channels awaiting removal. The ziggurat dominated the urban landscape, a massive stepped pyramid rising approximately 21 meters high, with 3 staircases converging on a platform that held a shrine where the moon god Nana-Sin was believed to dwell. The structure required millions of mud bricks, each one shaped by hand, dried in the sun, laid with bitumen mortar. Leonard Woolley's excavations in the 1920s revealed the ziggurat's core structure, though the upper levels had collapsed or been destroyed centuries ago. Most people lived in single-story houses arranged around central courtyards. These homes typically contained 10-12 rooms, sleeping quarters, storage areas, kitchen spaces, sometimes a family chapel. The wealthy had 2-story structures with more rooms, better ventilation, sometimes private bathing facilities. Archaeological excavation of residential quarters reveals standardized layouts, suggesting building codes or common architectural traditions. The house walls were thick, sometimes 60 centimeters of mud brick, providing insulation against summer heat and winter cold. Roofs were flat, constructed from wood beams covered with reed mats and mud, requiring annual maintenance after the rainy season. Many families slept on the roof during summer months when indoor temperatures became unbearable. Winter nights brought everyone inside, gathering around small braziers for warmth. Water came from wells or canals. Women carried vessels on their heads, a daily labor that structured domestic routines. The wealthy had servants for this work. Everyone else managed themselves. Archaeological evidence shows wear patterns on steps leading to water sources, millions of footsteps over decades creating permanent grooves in stone. The temple economy employed significant portions of the population: priests, scribes, singers, musicians, craftspeople producing goods for ritual use, farmers working temple fields, shepherds tending temple flocks. The temples functioned as economic centers, redistributing resources through rations paid to workers. A standard ration was approximately 1 liter of barley per day for an adult male, less for women and children, supplemented with oil, dates, occasional fish or meat. Scribal schools, edubas, trained boys from wealthy families in the complex art of cuneiform. The training lasted years, beginning with memorizing sign lists, progressing to mathematical tables, then legal formularies, finally literary compositions. Teachers were strict. Physical punishment, Common for errors or laziness, tablets preserve complaints from students about the difficulty of their studies, the harshness of their instructors, their desire to be done with education and begin earning positions as professional scribes. Beer was the universal beverage. Water from canals and wells often carried disease. Brewing killed pathogens and provided calories that supplemented the barley-heavy diet. Men and women both drank beer, though women typically brewed it. Taverns operated throughout cities, social spaces where workers gathered after labor, where deals were negotiated, where news and gossip circulated. Some legal texts specifically regulate tavern behavior, suggesting they could be rowdy places requiring oversight. The city's walls, massive mud brick fortifications, stood 8 meters high and thick enough for guards to walk along the top. Gates controlled entry, opening at dawn and closing at dusk. Outside the walls lay the agricultural hinterland, fields extending as far as irrigation could reach, gradually giving way to desert or marsh depending on direction. Inside, the density of human activity created an environment unlike anything most people living today can quite imagine. Thousands of people in close proximity, without modern sanitation, without electricity, without any of the infrastructure we consider essential to urban life. Markets operated daily in open areas. Merchants displayed grain, dates, textiles, pottery, metal tools, luxury items imported from distant lands, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, carnelian from India, cedar from Lebanon. Sumerian merchants traveled extensively, establishing colonies in distant regions, creating trade networks that connected the known world. Cuneiform tablets record commercial transactions in detail, amounts bought and sold, prices paid, credit extended, debts owed. Temples held festivals throughout the year, marking agricultural seasons, honoring specific deities, celebrating military victories or royal achievements. These festivals involved processions through city streets, special offerings at temples, public feasting, sometimes theatrical performances of mythological episodes. The Akitu festival, celebrating the new year, involved the king ritually abasing himself before the gods, having his royal insignia temporarily removed, then being restored to power as confirmation of divine support. At night, oil lamps provided the only artificial light. Most people slept soon after sunset, rose with dawn. The wealthy could afford more oil, could extend their evenings with reading or conversation. The stars were visible every clear night in numbers that modern light pollution has rendered nearly impossible to see. Astronomical observation wasn't just priestly activity, but part of ordinary experience. Everyone could identify major constellations, recognize planets, track the moon's phases. Crime was punished according to law codes that survive in multiple versions. The Code of Ur-Nammu, the earliest known law code, dates to approximately 2100 BCE. It established fixed monetary penalties for various offences rather than physical mutilation, showing relatively sophisticated legal thinking. Murder, robbery, adultery, false accusations all carried specified punishments. Courts operated through temple and palace authority, with judges hearing cases, examining evidence, rendering verdicts. Slavery existed, but functioned differently than New World plantation slavery. Debt slaves worked to pay off obligations, could theoretically gain freedom. War captives became slaves, but weren't distinguished by race or ethnicity. Temple and palace slaves worked in organized labor gangs, maintained some rights, could sometimes own property. The system was exploitation, certainly, but integrated into social structure in ways that made it seem natural to those living within it. Women's status varied by class and situation. Temple priestesses, especially those serving Inanna, held high status and significant power. Merchant women conducted business independently, but most women's lives centered on domestic labor: cooking, spinning, weaving, child-rearing. Legal texts show women could own property, initiate divorce under certain circumstances, bring legal complaints. They weren't entirely without agency, but society was thoroughly patriarchal in structure and values. Children played in streets and courtyards. Archaeological excavations find toys, small clay animals, rattles, balls. Childhood mortality was high, perhaps 30–40% dying before age 5. Those who survived became economically productive early, helping with household labor from age 6 or 7, learning trades through apprenticeship in teenage years. The question remains whether this civilization's self-understanding as serving the gods, as created for divine purposes, as existing within a cosmos populated by active divine beings, reflects theological interpretation of natural order, or preserves memory of actual relationships with beings who are present, active, requiring service. The archaeological evidence shows cities, temples, texts, trade networks. It shows a civilization that lasted millennia, adapting to invasions, climate changes, political transformations, but maintaining core cultural continuity. What it doesn't show definitively is whether the gods they worshipped were imaginative constructs or literal presences. The texts claim the latter. They describe gods walking among humans, dwelling in temples, requiring food and clothing, making decisions that affected human destiny. Whether we read this literally or metaphorically changes everything about how we understand Sumerian civilization and our own place in the deep history of human culture. The tablets still speak, the ruins still stand, and beneath Iraqi sand, more evidence waits, more texts remain unexcavated, more discoveries that might clarify or complicate, or completely transform current understanding of what the Sumerians knew, what they experienced, what they were trying to tell us, across the enormous distance of 40 centuries. In 1976, a former journalist named Zecharia Sitchin published The 12th Planet, a book that would transform how millions of people understood ancient Mesopotamian texts. Sitchin wasn't an academic Assyriologist. He had studied economics and history, learned Hebrew, taught himself to read cuneiform from published dictionaries and sign lists. His approach was that of an investigative researcher rather than a trained scholar, and this outsider perspective led him to interpretations that mainstream academia would reject, but that captured public imagination with remarkable force. Sitchin's central thesis was radical. The Sumerian texts weren't mythology but literal historical records. The Anunnaki weren't gods in the theological sense, but extraterrestrial beings who came to Earth approximately 450,000 years ago from a planet called Nibiru. This planet, Sitchin claimed, followed a long elliptical orbit through our solar system, returning to Earth's vicinity every 3,600 years. The Anunnaki descended from this planet, established bases in Mesopotamia, and began mining operations to extract gold. Why gold? Sitchin proposed that the Anunnaki needed it to create a protective shield in their planet's atmosphere. Mining required intensive labor. Initially, the Anunnaki themselves performed this work exactly as the Atrahasis epic describes. When they rebelled after 40 years, the solution was genetic engineering. Create a worker species by modifying existing hominids with Anunnaki DNA. This genetic manipulation, Sitchin argued, explained the sudden appearance of anatomically modern humans in the archaeological record, explained humanity's inexplicable leap from primitive hunter-gatherers to civilized city builders. He pointed to specific Sumerian terms, reinterpreting their meanings. The word din.gir, conventionally translated as gods, Sitchin read as those who from heaven to earth came. The Anunnaki's title An.una.ki, he passed as those who came from heaven to earth. Every reference to gods descending, to divine beings arriving from the heavens, became in his framework literal spaceflight rather than metaphorical divine presence. The texts describing creation of humanity, through mixing clay and divine blood, Sitchin interpreted as describing genetic engineering in pre-scientific language. The clay was the existing hominid DNA, the divine blood was Anunnaki genetic material. The goddess Ninchu wasn't a deity, but a geneticist. The process described in the texts wasn't theological metaphor, but the best description ancient peoples could give for procedures they witnessed but couldn't technically understand. Mainstream scholars responded with significant criticism. Academic Assyriologists pointed out that Sitchin's translations were often inaccurate, based on selective readings that ignored grammatical context and broader textual meaning. His astronomical claims about Nibiru contradicted basic physics regarding orbital mechanics and planetary formation. His timeline for human evolution didn't align with genetic or archaeological evidence. The similarities between ancient texts and modern scientific concepts that he emphasized were, critics argued, the result of forcing modern interpretations onto ancient material rather than reading the texts in their own cultural context. Yet Sitchin's work resonated with readers worldwide. Multiple sequels followed, each expanding the framework, incorporating Egyptian, Hebrew, Mesoamerican, and other ancient traditions into a unified theory of extraterrestrial intervention in human development. The book sold millions of copies, translated into dozens of languages. Ancient astronaut theory, while not originating with Sitchin, found its most detailed and influential expression through his work. The appeal is understandable. Sitchin's framework offered answers to questions that trouble many people. Why did civilization arise so suddenly? Why do ancient peoples describe gods with such specific physical presence? How did Neolithic cultures develop astronomical knowledge that seems beyond their technological means? Why do global mythologies share similar themes of sky gods, floods, divine human hybrids? Ancient astronaut theory provides a unified explanation that feels more concrete than academic responses about symbolic thinking and cultural transmission. It also satisfies a desire for human significance. In Sitchin's telling, we aren't random products of evolutionary chance, but designed beings, created with purpose, connected to cosmic drama extending beyond our planet. This narrative offers meaning, suggests that human existence matters in ways that purely materialistic explanations don't capture. For readers seeking spiritual significance outside traditional religious frameworks, ancient astronaut theory provides alternative cosmology that feels both ancient and modern. The scholarly community largely dismissed Sitchin's work, viewing it as pseudo-archaeology that misled the public about what ancient texts actually say and what archaeological evidence actually shows. Professional organizations published refutations. Documentaries featured Assyriologists explaining where Sitchin's translations went wrong. Yet the debate continued, with Sitchin's supporters arguing that mainstream academia was protecting orthodoxy, resisting evidence that challenged established narratives. What's interesting is how thoroughly Sitchin's interpretations have penetrated popular culture. Television shows exploring ancient mysteries regularly reference his ideas. Online communities debate his claims. His framework has become the default lens through which many people encounter Sumerian texts, even if they've never read his books directly. The Anunnaki are now widely recognized as ancient astronauts rather than Mesopotamian deities, a testament to how alternative interpretations can reshape public understanding regardless of academic consensus. Other researchers built on Sitchin's foundation or developed parallel theories. Erich von Däniken's Chariots of the Gods, 1968, predated Sitchin, but explored similar themes. More recent writers like Michael Tellinger, Gerald Clark, and others have expanded ancient astronaut interpretations, incorporating modern genetics, astronomy, and archaeology into frameworks that mainstream science rejects, but that continue finding audiences. The question becomes, how do we evaluate competing interpretations of the same evidence? Academic standards emphasize linguistic expertise, contextual understanding, consistency with broader archaeological patterns. Alternative researchers emphasize open-minded consideration of anomalies, willingness to question established narratives, connecting disparate pieces of evidence into larger patterns. Neither approach is inherently invalid, but they lead to radically different conclusions. Perhaps the most valuable aspect of this debate is how it forces careful examination of what the texts actually say, what we truly know versus what we assume. When academic scholars defend mainstream interpretations against alternative theories, they must articulate their reasoning clearly, explain their translation choices, acknowledge areas of uncertainty. When alternative researchers challenge orthodoxy, they push for reconsideration of assumptions that may have calcified into unquestioned dogma. The Sumerian text remained the same. Clay tablets pressed millennia ago. Wedge marks forming words in a dead language. What changes is how we read them, what questions we bring, what answers we're willing to accept, and in that space between text and interpretation, between ancient voice and modern understanding, the mystery deepens rather than resolves. Translation is never neutral. Every choice a scholar makes in rendering Sumerian or Akkadian into English involves interpretation, involves judgment calls about what a term most likely meant in its original context. The distance between languages separated by 4,000 years ensures that perfect translation remains impossible. What we have are approximations, scholarly best guesses, readings that gain authority through consensus but remain fundamentally uncertain in crucial places. Consider the term din.grr, a Sumerian word conventionally translated as god or deity. The cuneiform signs combine two elements, din, which relates to purity or divine status, and din-rr, which can mean fire or pillar or bright. Mainstream Assyriologists read this as a compound term meaning divine being or god, understanding it as theological category. Sitchin and followers read it as righteous ones of the bright fire, or those who came from the heavens in fiery ships, interpreting the term as describing extraterrestrial visitors traveling in spacecraft. Which reading is correct? The answer depends partly on other contexts where the term appears, partly on grammatical structure, partly on assumptions about what Sumerians could have experienced or imagined. Academic scholars argue that ancient peoples regularly used fire imagery for divine beings, without implying literal spacecraft. Alternative researchers counter that the specificity of descriptions suggests literal rather than metaphorical meaning. The word Anunnaki itself presents similar challenges. The components are clear enough: An, sky, heaven; Unna, power, sky, heaven, but how they combine into meaning remains debated. Powerful ones of heaven and earth, those who came from heaven to earth, sky-earth gods. Each translation carries implications about who or what the Anunnaki were. A slight shift in emphasis, a different passing of grammatical relationship, and the entire meaning changes. Mainstream translations emphasize continuity with broader Mesopotamian theology. The Anunnaki appear alongside other divine groups: the Agigi, heavenly gods; the Sabiti, the seven; various minor deities serving specific functions. Academic scholarship reads all these as components of a complex polytheistic system, personified natural forces and abstract concepts arranged in hierarchies that reflected and reinforced social structures. Alternative translations emphasize uniqueness and specific detail. When texts describe Anunnaki descending in boats from the heavens, conventional translation reads boats as metaphorical vehicles of divine travel. Alternative translation asks why the texts would use the term for physical boats if they meant something abstract. When texts describe the Anunnaki wearing bird costumes or having bird features, mainstream scholarship sees ritual garb or symbolic representation. Alternative interpretation asks whether these describe spacesuits or flight gear. The Enuma Elish describes Marduk creating the heavens and earth from Tiamat's body. The text gives specific astronomical details. He set up 3 paths of stars, established the positions of planets, determined the moon's phases. Mainstream scholars read this as mythological explanation for cosmic order, perhaps incorporating actual astronomical observations, but fundamentally theological in purpose. Alternative readers note the accuracy of astronomical detail and suggest the text preserves scientific knowledge that seems remarkably advanced for the period. One particularly controversial passage describes the solar system. Sitchin claimed Sumerian astronomy knew of planets not visible to the naked eye, suggesting either advanced telescopes or information provided by extraterrestrial visitors. Academic astronomers and Assyriologists have thoroughly refuted this claim, showing that Sitchin misread the texts, confused different celestial bodies, imposed modern solar system understanding onto ancient cosmology that operated under different assumptions. Yet something genuine underlies the debate. Mesopotamian astronomy was remarkably sophisticated. By the 1st millennium BCE, Babylonian astronomers could predict planetary positions, calculate eclipse cycles, track precession of the equinoxes. Mathematical tablets show complex calculations involving sexagesimal base 60 number systems that remain useful today in measuring time and angles. How did this knowledge develop? The standard academic answer points to centuries of careful observation, record-keeping, mathematical modeling. Alternative researchers ask whether this knowledge was inherited from earlier sources, possibly non-human. The flood narratives present another area where textual interpretation diverges. Multiple Mesopotamian texts describe catastrophic flooding. Geological evidence confirms major flood events in Mesopotamian history. Mainstream scholarship sees cultural memory of natural disasters mythologized into cosmic significance. Alternative interpretation asks whether these texts describe specific catastrophic events, meteor impacts, planetary near misses, deliberate destruction by advanced beings. The text of Atrahasis specifies that humanity was becoming too numerous, too noisy, and Lil couldn't sleep. This motivated the decision to send the flood. Reading this theologically, it expresses anxiety about population growth, divine irritation at human vitality. Reading it literally, it describes a decision by extraterrestrial administrators to reduce an expanding population that threatened their control or consumed resources beyond sustainable levels. Professional Assyriologists emphasize the importance of reading texts within their literary genre. Ancient Near Eastern literature used conventional forms, standard phrases, recurring themes. Creation myths across the region share similar structures because they drew from common traditions, not because they described identical events. Flood narratives appear in multiple cultures because flooding was universal human experience, not because one specific deluge occurred that all cultures remembered. But alternative researchers point to specific details that seem too consistent across cultures to be independent invention. The boat dimensions in various flood narratives show mathematical relationships. The duration of floods matches across texts separated by centuries and distance. The sequence of events, including birds sent to test for land, appears in Mesopotamian, Hebrew, and other traditions with suspicious similarity. DNA evidence has complicated the picture. Modern genetics shows that all humans share common ancestors, that genetic diversity indicates ancient population bottlenecks, that human evolution involved interbreeding with Neanderthals and Denisovans. Does this support or challenge ancient astronaut theory? Depends on interpretation. Mainstream science sees natural evolutionary processes. Alternative researchers see potential evidence of genetic engineering, the mixing described in creation texts. The texts themselves often acknowledge uncertainty. Sumerian literature includes passages where narrators express doubt, where divine motivations remain opaque, where events are described as mysterious even to those recording them. This humility before the unknown contrasts with both rigid academic orthodoxy and rigid alternative certainty. Perhaps the ancients were more comfortable with mystery than we are, more willing to preserve questions alongside answers. What remains undisputed is that the texts exist, that they preserve consistent traditions across millennia, that they describe divine beings with specific names, roles, and relationships. Whether these beings were theological constructs, personified forces, or literal entities continues dividing interpretation. The gap between academic and alternative readings shows no sign of closing. Both sides have invested heavily in their frameworks, both see evidence supporting their positions, both view the other as either closed-minded or credulous. And so the tablets sit in museums and storage rooms, their cuneiform marks pressed by hands that turned to dust millennia ago, still generating debate, still resisting final interpretation. They speak, but we argue about what they're saying. Perhaps that ongoing argument is itself valuable, keeping us engaged with deep questions about origins, purposes, the relationship between myth and history, the possibility that reality might be stranger than either orthodox academic or conventional religious frameworks allow. Beneath the ziggurat, Leonard Woolley's excavations in the 1920s uncovered something unexpected. Below the temple foundations, below the earliest occupation levels, lay a layer of clean water-laid silt, 2.4 meters thick, absolutely sterile of artifacts or organic material. This deposit separated earlier settlement remains from later construction, indicating a period when the site stood underwater, when life ceased completely before resuming after the waters receded. Woolley believed he'd found evidence of the biblical flood. Initial reports described the discovery in dramatic terms, proof that the Genesis narrative recorded actual events. But further excavation at other Sumerian sites complicated the picture. Flood deposits appeared at different stratigraphic levels, indicating multiple flooding events at different times. Kish showed flood layers dated to approximately 2900 BCE. Shuruppak had deposits from roughly 2750 BCE. Ur's flood stratum dated to around 4000 BCE, far earlier than the others. What this geological evidence reveals is that catastrophic flooding was recurring reality in ancient Mesopotamia, not singular apocalyptic event. The Tigris and Euphrates, unlike the predictable Nile, flooded irregularly and sometimes devastatingly. Cities were periodically inundated, populations displaced, cultural continuity disrupted. Any one of these events could have entered cultural memory as the flood, or perhaps multiple floods merged in collective remembering into a single archetypal catastrophe. Yet the consistency of flood narratives across cultures continues raising questions. Why do Mesopotamian, biblical, and other ancient traditions describe boats built to specific dimensions, animals saved in pairs, birds sent to test for land? Cultural transmission explains some similarities, but the details align in ways that suggest either common source or common experience. Neither explanation fully satisfies. Both leave aspects unexplained. The precision of Mesopotamian mathematics and astronomy presents another anomaly that generates competing interpretations. Clay tablets from the Old Babylonian period show mathematical problems involving Pythagorean triples more than 1,000 years before Pythagoras. Astronomical texts predict lunar eclipses with accuracy that requires sophisticated understanding of orbital mechanics. The Muldota pin tablets catalogue stars and constellations, tracking their heliacal risings, calculating the length of daylight throughout the year. How did this knowledge develop? Standard academic explanation points to centuries of patient observation, record-keeping across generations, gradual refinement of mathematical models. This process is well documented for later periods. We have continuous series of astronomical observations from Babylon, covering centuries, showing systematic data collection and analysis. The knowledge arose through human effort, human intelligence applied consistently over time. Alternative interpretation suggests this knowledge was inherited rather than developed, that earlier advanced civilization or non-human teachers provided information that later cultures preserved and elaborated. Proponents point to the seemingly sudden appearance of sophisticated concepts in the archaeological record, the lack of evidence for gradual development. Critics counter that absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence, that much early material has been lost to time, and that the progression from simple to complex is visible when enough texts survive. The famous Antikythera mechanism, though not Mesopotamian, demonstrates that ancient civilizations achieved technological sophistication far beyond what surviving artifacts usually suggest. This Greek astronomical computer from around 100 BCE incorporated bronze gears calculating planetary positions, eclipse predictions, Olympic game cycles. Nothing similar survives until medieval Islamic astronomy and European clockwork. Does this indicate lost knowledge, advanced civilization that declined, or simply the rarity of preservation for complex mechanisms? Megalithic construction techniques present persistent puzzles, while Mesopotamian architecture primarily used mud brick, which erodes easily. Certain structures incorporated massive stone blocks fitted with precision that's difficult to explain using documented ancient methods. The question isn't whether ancient peoples could move heavy stones. They demonstrably could. The question is how they achieved tolerances of less than a millimeter between irregular surfaces, creating joints so tight that modern paper can't fit between blocks. Mainstream archaeology proposes copper tools, pounding stones, abrasive sand for shaping. Experimental archaeology has successfully replicated some ancient construction techniques, showing that patient labor with simple tools can achieve impressive results. But experiments haven't fully replicated the finest examples of ancient stonework, leaving room for speculation about lost techniques, possibly involving tools or knowledge that didn't survive in the archaeological record. The Ubaid figurines with their elongated heads and large eyes continue puzzling researchers. Thousands have been found across Mesopotamia, spanning centuries of the Ubaid period before the Sumerians. They appear in domestic contexts and temple contexts, suggesting religious significance, but their meaning remains uncertain. Art historians see stylized human forms, possibly representing spiritual states or mythological beings. Alternative researchers see them as evidence of non-human beings present in ancient Mesopotamia, perhaps the Anunnaki themselves represented in clay. What's notable is that these figurines predate the emergence of writing, meaning we have no contemporary texts explaining what they represented. Later Sumerian art shows gods with human form, sometimes with divine attributes like horned crowns or wings, but not with the strange proportions of Ubaid figurines. Did artistic conventions change? Did the beings represented change? Or do the figurines represent something else entirely that we're misinterpreting due to lack of cultural context? Underground structures at some Mesopotamian sites present additional mysteries. At Tel Es-Sawan in Iraq, excavations revealed subterranean chambers lined with gypsum plaster, dated to around 6000 BCE. Their purpose remains debated. Storage, burials, ritual spaces. The effort required to excavate into the water table and line chambers with plaster suggests significant importance, but archaeological context provides limited clues about function. Modern remote sensing technology has revealed extensive ancient irrigation networks, canal systems stretching across hundreds of kilometers, requiring centralized planning and massive labor coordination. The sophistication of water management in ancient Mesopotamia exceeded what many people assume possible for primitive civilizations. These weren't simple ditches, but engineered systems with calculated gradients, flow control structures, distribution networks serving multiple cities. This level of organization required advanced mathematical knowledge, surveying techniques, centralized authority, capable of coordinating labor across vast territories. It demonstrates that early civilizations were far more capable than popular imagination often credits. But it also raises the question, where did this knowledge come from? How did people just emerging from Neolithic village life suddenly develop the engineering expertise to create continental-scale irrigation networks? Perhaps the question itself is flawed, assuming too much discontinuity. Modern scholarship increasingly recognizes that the transition from hunting-gathering to agriculture to urban civilization was gradual, complex, non-linear. Knowledge accumulated incrementally. Successes were copied, failures avoided. Over centuries, what seems miraculous becomes explicable as the result of countless small innovations building on each other. Yet the texts themselves claim divine instruction. They describe gods teaching humanity agriculture, mathematics, writing, law. Mainstream scholarship reads this as theological explanation, humans attributing their own achievements to divine gift. Alternative interpretation takes the claims more literally, suggesting actual transfer of knowledge from more advanced beings to less advanced humans. The mystery deepens rather than resolves. Each archaeological discovery provides new data, but data requires interpretation, and interpretation depends on framework. Two scholars examining identical evidence can reach opposite conclusions based on different assumptions about what's possible, what ancient peoples could have known, what explanations are most parsimonious. And beneath Iraqi sand, beneath modern cities and agricultural fields, more evidence waits. Unexcavated tells hold tablets not yet read, structures not yet uncovered, artifacts that might clarify or complicate current understanding. The work continues, patient excavation and careful analysis, building understanding layer by layer, pressing toward truth that remains partially hidden, waiting in darkness for human curiosity to bring it back into light. Among the most dramatic passages in Sumerian and Akkadian literature are descriptions of divine conflict, battles between gods using weapons of terrible power. These texts employ language that has sparked intense debate about whether they describe mythological combat or preserve memories of actual warfare witnessed by ancient peoples. The Lugal-e epic, composed around 2000 BCE, describes a war between Ninurta, a warrior god associated with agriculture and storms, and an entity called Arzag, described as a demon or chaos monster dwelling in the mountains. Ninurta attacks with weapons that cause the earth to shake, that send fire from the heavens, that turn stone to dust. The battle devastates the landscape, alters geography, creates new features in the terrain. After Ninurta's victory, he reorganizes the land, establishes proper water flow, makes the earth productive. Mainstream scholarship reads this as mythological explanation for geological features, personified natural forces in combat, representing the ongoing struggle between order and chaos, fertility and barrenness. The weapons Ninurta wields are thunderbolts, storms, floods, the natural forces that shape landscape over time. His victory represents the triumph of agricultural civilization over wilderness, the taming of nature for human benefit. Alternative interpretation asks whether the descriptions preserve memory of actual weapons technology. The text mentions stones that flash fire, weapons that produce noise like thunder, devices that turn the mountains to scorched earth. Could these describe advanced weaponry, energy weapons, nuclear devices? The language seems strikingly specific for purely mythological invention, yet translating ancient terms into modern technological concepts requires enormous interpretive leaps. Another text describes warfare between Inanna and the mountain god Ebi. Inanna approaches An, the sky god, requesting permission to destroy Ebi, who has shown her disrespect. An initially refuses, warning that Ebi is too powerful, that the mountain's strength exceeds what Inanna can overcome. But Inanna persists, arms herself with divine weapons, and attacks. The text describes her using the bolt of lightning and weapons that produce radiance. The mountain is shattered, its forests burned, its cities destroyed. What occurred at Sodom and Gomorrah? Biblical texts describe these cities destroyed by fire from heaven, burning sulfur raining down, inhabitants fleeing while anyone looking back is turned to a pillar of salt. Archaeological surveys in the Dead Sea region have identified sites destroyed by catastrophic fire around 2000 BCE. Analysis of the destruction layers shows extreme temperatures far exceeding what normal building fires produce. Some researchers propose meteor airburst, similar to the Tunguska event. Others suggest earthquake-triggering natural gas explosions. A few alternative theorists propose nuclear weapons deployed by the Anunnaki during conflicts described in cuneiform texts. The connection to Mesopotamian texts comes through shared geography and chronology. If the biblical destruction occurred around 2000 BCE, this coincides with periods of political upheaval in Mesopotamia, wars between city-states, invasions by outside powers. Some texts from this period describe cities destroyed so completely that they became proverbial examples of annihilation. Could some of these destructions have resulted from weapons technology far exceeding conventional warfare? Mainstream historians point out that ancient cities were frequently destroyed by conquest, fire, and natural disaster. Mud brick structures burn readily. Stored grain and oil provide fuel for devastating conflagrations. Earthquake-prone regions experience catastrophic destruction periodically. The archaeological evidence of extreme heat doesn't necessarily indicate exotic weapons, just thorough burning of cities that were fundamentally inflammable. Yet certain details trouble straightforward naturalistic explanations. The Era epic, dating to around 800 BCE but possibly preserving earlier traditions, describes a plague god named Era, who becomes angry and decides to devastate the earth. He unleashes weapons described as scorching flames, devices that produce radiance like the sun, forces that cause cities to become uninhabitable for generations. The text specifically mentions that regions affected by Era's weapons remain barren, that vegetation doesn't grow, that those who enter the devastated zones become sick. Could this describe radiation effects? Alternative researchers emphasize the specificity, not just destruction but lingering contamination, sickness affecting those who approach the ruined areas, land remaining sterile long after the attack. Academic scholars counter that these effects align with other explanations: salt poisoning of soil, psychological trauma creating cultural avoidance, standard hyperbole in ancient warfare descriptions. The Mahabharata from India describes weapons called Brahmastra that produce similar effects: blinding light, scorching heat, devastation affecting the earth for generations, warriors who survive the initial blast dying within days from mysterious ailments. The parallels between Indian and Mesopotamian texts raise questions about whether both cultures witnessed similar events, or whether descriptions of ultimate weapons naturally gravitate towards similar imagery, regardless of actual capabilities. Some researchers have identified possible evidence of ancient nuclear warfare, vitrified stone at various archaeological sites, showing temperatures exceeding what conventional fires produce, skeletal remains with radiation damage, crater formations inconsistent with meteor impacts. Each piece of evidence has been challenged by mainstream scientists offering conventional explanations, yet the accumulation of anomalies continues fueling speculation. Perhaps the most striking description comes from the Epic of Gilgamesh, when Enkidu dreams of the underworld and describes it in terms that some interpret as describing nuclear devastation, darkness at noon, ash covering everything, survivors wandering like ghosts among ruins, the very air poisoned. Conventional reading sees this as typical ancient Near Eastern underworld imagery, the realm of the dead described through metaphors of desolation and decay. Alternative reading suggests it preserves eyewitness description of aftermath from weapons of mass destruction. We may never definitively prove what these texts describe. The events occurred too long ago. The evidence is fragmentary. The possibilities range too widely. Natural disasters, conventional warfare, mythological imagination, and lost technologies all remain viable explanations depending on what assumptions we bring to interpretation. What's undeniable is that ancient peoples witnessed catastrophes that traumatized them deeply enough to preserve in their most sacred texts. Cities were destroyed, populations were devastated, the earth was scarred. Whether these catastrophes resulted from divine wrath, natural disaster, or weapons technology, they shaped how ancient civilizations understood their world, their vulnerability, their relationship to powers beyond human control. The texts describe the Anunnaki participating in these conflicts, sometimes as instigators, sometimes as reluctant participants, sometimes as victims. In the flood narrative, they weep at the destruction they've helped unleash. In warfare texts, they fight among themselves, divine factions backing different cities, using powers that humans can barely comprehend. The picture that emerges is complex, morally ambiguous, showing divine beings capable of both creation and terrible destruction. If we read these texts literally, as alternative researchers propose, we confront disturbing implications. Beings with advanced technology intervened in human affairs, fought wars that devastated populations, treated humanity as expendable. If we read them mythologically, as mainstream scholars advocate, we see ancient peoples grappling with the reality of violence, trying to make sense of destruction through narratives of cosmic struggle. Perhaps both readings capture something true. Perhaps ancient peoples witnessed events they couldn't fully explain, described them using the conceptual vocabulary available to them, preserved memories that remain ambiguous, because the events themselves were partially incomprehensible. The gap between experience and understanding might explain why the text remained so resistant to definitive interpretation. The war between competing interpretations continues, each side marshalling evidence, challenging the other's assumptions, seeking to establish their framework as most accurately explaining the ancient texts and archaeological record. But the texts themselves remain patient, clay tablets pressed millennia ago, carrying descriptions that continue generating wonder, debate, and the unsettling possibility that our understanding of the ancient past might be far from complete. Two fundamentally different worldviews approach identical evidence and reach opposite conclusions. The division isn't simply academic disagreement about details, but reflects deeper assumptions about reality, about what's possible, about how to evaluate claims that challenge conventional understanding. Mainstream academic framework operates within methodological naturalism, the principle that scientific explanations should invoke only natural causes and processes. When ancient texts describe gods descending from heaven, scholars interpret this as theological metaphor, as human attempts to understand divine transcendence through spatial imagery. When texts describe humanity created from divine blood and clay, scholars see mythological explanation for human nature, the combination of mortal body and conscious mind. When texts describe weapons of devastating power, scholars interpret hyperbolic warfare descriptions, natural disasters given supernatural explanation. This approach emphasizes continuity with known historical and archaeological patterns. Civilizations develop gradually through accumulation of knowledge and technique. Mythologies reflect cultural values and social structures. Religious texts express theological truths through narrative, rather than providing literal historical records. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and alternative interpretations fail to meet that standard according to academic consensus. Alternative framework begins with different assumptions. It questions whether methodological naturalism adequately captures the full range of human experience and historical possibility. When ancient texts consistently describe beings descending from the heavens, alternative researchers ask why we should automatically assume this is metaphorical. When multiple cultures separated by vast distances describe similar events, they suggest this indicates common source or common experience, rather than independent invention. When archaeological evidence includes anomalies that don't fit conventional timelines, they propose this indicates gaps in our understanding, rather than errors in the evidence. This approach emphasizes discontinuity, sudden appearances of knowledge or capability that seem to lack developmental stages. It questions whether the conventional explanation, patient accumulation over centuries, adequately accounts for the sophistication visible in early civilizations. It suggests that textual evidence deserves more literal consideration, that ancient peoples might have been describing their actual experiences rather than constructing pure mythology. The astronomical knowledge embedded in ancient texts provides a particular point of contention. Mesopotamian astronomy tracked 5 visible planets, could predict eclipses, understood precession of the equinoxes. This knowledge appears in texts early enough that its development should be documented if it arose through observation. Yet the earliest astronomical texts already display sophistication that suggests long prior development, even though no earlier text survives showing that development. Mainstream explanation points to lost texts, oral traditions that preceded writing, knowledge accumulated over generations before being recorded. Just because we don't have the earliest stages documented doesn't mean they didn't exist. The absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence, particularly given how little ancient material survives. Fire, flood, deliberate destruction, simple decay across millennia, all ensure that what we possess represents a tiny fraction of what originally existed. Alternative explanation suggests this knowledge was inherited from earlier advanced civilization or provided by non-human teachers. The sophistication appears too suddenly, the development stages are missing, and the texts themselves claim divine instruction. Why not take these claims seriously, rather than automatically dismissing them as mythological? Similar debates surround megalithic construction. Academic archaeology has successfully demonstrated many ancient techniques through experimental replication. Stone can be moved using sledges, rollers, ramps. It can be shaped using copper tools, pounding stones, abrasive sand. Given sufficient labor and time, impressive results can be achieved with simple technology. This approach respects ancient people's intelligence and capability, shows they didn't require external help to accomplish what they built. Yet experimental archaeology hasn't successfully replicated the finest examples of ancient stonework, the precision joints, the massive blocks placed at significant heights. Alternative researchers argue this gap between what we can demonstrate and what ancients achieved indicates missing knowledge, possibly including tools or techniques that haven't survived in the archaeological record. They don't claim ancient peoples were incapable, rather that they had access to knowledge or resources we don't fully understand. The genetic evidence regarding human origins adds another layer of complexity. Modern DNA analysis shows that anatomically modern humans emerged in Africa around 300,000 years ago, migrated globally in waves, interbred with archaic human species like Neanderthals and Denisovanes. This genetic record supports evolutionary explanations for human origins. It doesn't show sudden insertion of alien DNA or genetic engineering events. Alternative researchers respond that genetic engineering would look like accelerated evolution in the archaeological record, that the relatively rapid emergence of behavioral modernity around 50,000 years ago might reflect cognitive enhancements from genetic manipulation. They point to unexplained genetic features, rapid brain size increases, capabilities that seem to exceed what natural selection alone would produce. Mainstream geneticists counter that the data fits evolutionary models without requiring intervention, that human evolution shows the expected pattern of gradual change, punctuated by rapid shifts during environmental stress. Cross-cultural parallels in mythology present another area where frameworks diverge. Multiple ancient cultures describe great floods, divine beings teaching civilization, sky gods mating with humans to produce heroes. Academic folklore studies explain these parallels through diffusion, cultural contact allowing stories to spread and adapt, or through psychological universals, all humans sharing cognitive structures that generate similar narratives independently. Alternative researchers see the parallels as too specific for independent invention or simple diffusion. The flood accounts include identical details, specific boat dimensions, animals saved, birds sent to test for land. The descriptions of divine teachers include similar characteristics, bearded figures, association with water, gifts of agriculture and astronomy. Perhaps these similarities reflect common historical events rather than just common narrative structures. The question of falsifiability becomes crucial. What evidence would definitively prove or disprove either framework? If alternative theory is correct, what should we find? If mainstream explanation is correct, what evidence should be absent? The difficulty is that both frameworks can accommodate most evidence through different interpretations. A text describing gods might be mythology or history depending on your starting assumptions. An archaeological anomaly might be explained away or emphasized depending on your framework. Some scholars argue this makes alternative theories unfalsifiable, able to explain any evidence by invoking unknown ancient technologies or extraterrestrial intervention. Alternative researchers counter that mainstream archaeology is equally capable of explaining away anomalies by appealing to lost evidence or unknown techniques. Both sides accuse the other of circular reasoning, of seeing what they expect to see, rather than what the evidence actually shows. Perhaps the most productive approach acknowledges that certainty remains elusive. We don't definitively know how ancient civilizations developed their knowledge, whether gods were metaphors or memories, whether sophisticated capabilities arose internally or were taught by others. The evidence allows multiple interpretations. The texts preserve voices speaking across millennia, but those voices remain partially mysterious, their full meaning obscured by distance and difference. Both frameworks offer value. Academic rigor ensures claims are tested, alternative ideas are scrutinized, evidence is evaluated carefully. Alternative questioning ensures orthodoxy doesn't calcify, that anomalies receive attention, that possibilities beyond current paradigms remain open. The tension between them drives continued research, forces careful examination of assumptions, keeps conversations about the past dynamic rather than settled. What we can say with confidence is that ancient peoples were sophisticated, intelligent, capable of remarkable achievements. They observed their world carefully, recorded what they experienced, developed technologies and knowledge that continue impressing us. Whether they accomplished this entirely through human effort or received help from non-human sources remains one of archaeology's most fascinating unresolved questions. The tablets wait in museums, speaking but not definitively. The ruins stand in desert landscapes, impressive but ambiguous, and we continue trying to understand what happened in deep time, what the ancients knew, what they were trying to tell us across the vast distance of centuries. The mystery persists, perhaps rightfully, humbling our certainty while inviting continued exploration. The last cuneiform tablet was written around 75 CE, in a temple in Babylon, by priests maintaining traditions that reached back 3 millennia. By then, the Sumerian language had been dead for 2,000 years, preserved only as a liturgical language like Latin would become in medieval Europe. The old gods still received offerings, the old hymns were still chanted, but the world had changed utterly. Greek was the language of learning, Rome was the power that mattered, and the ancient Mesopotamian traditions were fading into memory. Within a century, even that memory had largely vanished. The temples closed, the priesthoods disbanded, the libraries where tablets were stored fell into ruin. Sand covered the cities, tells rose as successive occupations built atop older ruins, burying the past beneath layers of debris. For 1,500 years, Sumerian civilization existed only as faint echo in biblical narratives, vague references in Greek and Roman texts, ruins that travelers occasionally noted but couldn't interpret. Yet the memory didn't entirely die. It transformed, migrated, found new expressions in cultures that came after. Jewish scribes in Babylon during the exile absorbed Mesopotamian traditions, incorporated flood narratives and creation accounts into texts that became the Hebrew Bible. These stories traveled with Jewish communities, entered Christianity and Islam, shaped how half the world understood human origins and divine relationship. The Sumerian voice kept speaking, though filtered through theological frameworks the original tellers would barely recognize. Greek historians who visited Mesopotamia preserved fragments of information. Berossus, a Babylonian priest writing in Greek around 280 BCE, recorded Mesopotamian history and mythology for Greek audiences. His work survives only in quotations by later authors, but these fragments preserved king lists, creation accounts, flood narratives that would otherwise be entirely lost. Berossus wrote of beings called Oannas, fish-like creatures who emerged from the Persian Gulf and taught humanity civilization's arts. Some researchers see connections to the Anunnaki, to Enki's association with water and wisdom, suggesting continuity in traditions, even as languages and cultures changed. Arab scholars in medieval Baghdad knew they lived atop ancient ruins. They collected tablets when farmers uncovered them, tried unsuccessfully to decipher the wedge-shaped marks. Some tablets were ground into powder for medicinal use, their precious information destroyed by ignorance of what they contained. Others were preserved in private collections, curiosities whose meaning remained locked until European scholars developed tools for decipherment in the 19th century. The rediscovery began accidentally. In 1811, Claudius James Rich, a British resident in Baghdad, surveyed the ruins of Babylon and Nineveh, collecting artifacts, making measurements, producing the first modern descriptions of these sites. His work sparked European interest in Mesopotamian archaeology, Within decades, major expeditions were underway, competing for spectacular finds that could fill museums and advance national prestige. The British Museum acquired thousands of tablets from Nineveh, the library of Ashurbanipal, preserved by the fire that destroyed his palace. French excavators worked at sites across Mesopotamia, sending architectural elements and sculptures to the Louvre. German teams excavated Babylon under Kaiser Wilhelm's patronage, reconstructing portions of the Ishtar Gate in Berlin. American institutions joined later, establishing presences at Nippur, and other major sites. The tablets poured into museums faster than scholars could read them. Even now, after more than a century of systematic study, tens of thousands remain untranslated. They sit in storage rooms, awaiting specialists with the linguistic expertise and time to work through them. Each tablet might contain economic records, legal documents, letters between merchants, or fragments of literature that could reshape understanding. The work continues, patient and slow, revealing piece by piece what the ancients knew and believed. Modern technology has accelerated the process. Digital photography allows creation of comprehensive archives accessible to scholars worldwide. Machine learning algorithms assist in identifying damaged signs, suggesting probable readings where tablets are broken. Three-dimensional scanning preserves spatial information about artifacts, enabling virtual reconstruction of archaeological contexts. The field has transformed from individual scholars puzzling over tablets in isolation to international collaborative networks sharing data and insights. Recent discoveries continue revising understanding. In 2019, scholars working on previously unread tablets from the British Museum collection found new fragments of the Gilgamesh epic, including a scene not previously known. The Epic of Gilgamesh had been considered relatively complete, but this find revealed that gaps remain, that more of the story might still be recovered from unexamined material in museum storage or from sites not yet excavated. DNA analysis of ancient skeletal remains is adding biological context to textual history. We now know that populations in ancient Mesopotamia were genetically diverse, showed evidence of migration from multiple regions, mixed with incoming groups while maintaining cultural continuity. The people who created Sumerian civilization weren't isolated but connected through trade and movement to broader networks, stretching from the Mediterranean to the Indus Valley. Climate reconstruction using paleoclimatic data reveals how environmental changes affected these civilizations. Periods of drought correlate with political instability and urban abandonment. Favorable climate periods align with cultural flowering and territorial expansion. The relationship between environment and civilization becomes visible in ways that ancient texts alone don't capture, showing that human history unfolds within natural constraints that shape what becomes possible. The ongoing conflicts in Iraq and Syria have threatened archaeological sites, with deliberate destruction by extremist groups and looting driven by economic desperation. Yet even amid violence, work continues. Local archaeologists risk their lives to preserve their heritage. International teams plan for eventual return when security allows. The commitment to recovering and preserving this shared human past transcends modern political divisions. What drives this continued effort? Partly professional curiosity, the scholarly imperative to understand the past, partly cultural preservation, recognizing that these civilizations contributed foundational elements to modern life. But perhaps most fundamentally, the search reflects something deeper, a need to understand where we come from, to connect with the earliest humans who asked the same questions we still ask. The Sumerians wondered about their origins, their purpose, their relationship to divine powers. They created narratives explaining creation, destruction, renewal. They built cities and temples, developed writing and law, observed stars and planets, and they preserved all this in clay tablets that would outlast every other material they used, would survive conquest and fire and the slow erosion of millennia. We stand at the end of a long chain of transmission. The texts speak to us because 19th century scholars learned to read them, because 20th century archaeologists excavated them, because 21st century technology makes them accessible. But we also stand at the beginning of understanding what they mean, what implications they carry for how we understand human history and our place in the cosmos. Even now, somewhere in Iraqi soil, tablets wait that could clarify mysteries, answer questions, or raise entirely new puzzles. Even now, scholars are reading texts that haven't been examined in decades, finding details that previous researchers missed. The Anunnaki still generate debate, the flood still raises questions, the sudden emergence of sophisticated civilization still resists complete explanation. The stars that the Sumerians observed wheel overhead unchanged. The same planets trace the same paths, the same questions about existence, meaning and purpose that troubled ancient minds trouble ours. We use different language, different conceptual frameworks, but the fundamental human experience of wondering about our origins continues unbroken from their time to ours, and so the legacy persists. Not just in museums and academic journals, but in ongoing conversation about who we are and where we came from. The tablets speak, and we listen, and in that active attention across vast temporal distance, something essential about human consciousness reveals itself. We are the creature that remembers, that preserves, that seeks to understand the past, not just for knowledge, but for meaning. The story hasn't ended. It continues in every person who encounters these ancient texts, who feels wonder at what they contain, who asks what they might mean. The Sumerians created civilization's first written records. We inherit both their questions and their determination to seek answers, and perhaps that inheritance, more than any specific conclusion about gods or aliens or natural development, is the most valuable legacy they left us. Come back now to where you are, to the room around you, the darkness or dim light, the comfort of your bed or chair. The journey through deep time has brought us here, to this quiet moment, to your breathing steady and slow, to the present that continues regardless of what we understand or fail to understand about the distant past. The tablets still rest in their museum drawers and storage boxes. The cuneiform marks pressed 5,000 years ago remain legible to those who've learned to read them. The ruins still stand in Iraqi desert, tells rising above the plain, covering cities where people once lived, worked, worshipped, wondered about the same questions that occupy us now. Nothing we've said tonight has changed what's there, what happened, what the evidence shows or conceals. The Anunnaki, whether gods or myths or memories of something else entirely, persist in the texts that name them. Scholars will continue debating their nature, their reality, their meaning. New tablets will be read, new interpretations proposed, new technologies applied to old questions. The conversation continues, has always continued, will likely continue long after we're gone. This is how human understanding works, not through sudden revelation, but through patient accumulation of perspective, generation after generation, approaching the same evidence with fresh eyes. The stars that the Sumerians tracked in their astronomical texts still follow the same paths across the night sky. Planets still trace their orbits. The moon still waxes and wanes through phases that ancient peoples used to mark time, to establish calendars, to know when to plant and harvest. These cosmic patterns proceed indifferent to whether we understand them as divine beings or natural phenomena, whether we read ancient descriptions as literal or metaphorical. Perhaps the mystery itself holds value. Perhaps not knowing with certainty keeps us humble, keeps us questioning, prevents premature closure on questions that might not have simple answers. The gap between what ancient texts claim and what modern frameworks allow remains unbridged. Both sides of every debate have reasons for their positions, evidence they consider compelling, and maybe that tension, that ongoing negotiation between different ways of understanding, serves us better than false certainty would. Somewhere beneath Iraqi sand, more tablets wait in darkness that has lasted millennia. They contain words that no living person has read, stories that haven't been heard since the last ancient voice speaking them fell silent. They're patient, these clay documents. They've waited this long, they'll wait longer. Eventually someone will excavate them, clean them, translate them, add their contents to humanity's recovered memory, or they won't. Time and chance affect everything. What's preserved is partially accident, partially determined by forces beyond anyone's control. The wind still moves across the Mesopotamian plain, carrying dust from ruins that were once walls, temples, palaces. The Tigris and Euphrates still flow, though their courses have shifted, though dams now regulate what was once wild overflow. The land remembers in layers, each stratum holding fragments of what happened, who lived there, what they built and believed. Archaeology is the art of reading those layers, finding meaning in broken pottery and burned grain, reconstructing lives from refuse and remnants. And you're still here, breathing in the darkness, perhaps closer to sleep now than when we began. That's good. That's the purpose of this exploration, not to solve ancient mysteries, but to accompany you gently toward rest, to fill the quiet hours with voices from deep time, to let the enormous span of human history put present concerns into perspective that allows peace. The clay tablets speak their wedge-shaped words. The Anunnaki remain, whatever they were, names carved into stone and pressed into clay, part of humanity's oldest written legacy. The questions persist, unanswered, and perhaps unanswerable, waiting like stars in daylight, always present though not always visible. Rest now. The ancient world will still be there tomorrow, still mysterious, still speaking to those willing to listen. The work of understanding continues without requiring your attention. Let it go. Let the questions fade into the background hum of existence. Let sleep come if it wants to, or let gentle drowsiness hold you suspended between waking and dreaming, where the boundary between past and present grows thin, where ancient voices and modern thoughts mingle in darkness. The stars turn overhead, the earth continues its rotation, and somewhere in silence, in the spaces between words, in the gaps where clay has crumbled and meaning has been lost, the mystery endures.